There are moments in human curiosity when the line between imagination and reality begins to blur, when shadows on distant worlds ignite questions that refuse to fade. Mars, with its red dust and silent valleys, has always been more than a planet. It has been a mirror of our own desire to find others like us. Across decades, photographs of strange shapes, whispers of pyramids, and government files pulled from secrecy have painted a story that feels both impossible and irresistible. Some see only rocks carved by wind and time, but others glimpse something older, deliberate, a trace of intelligence that once breathed beneath a different sky. Legends of tall, slender beings, monuments half buried, and journeys across the stars emerge not only from fiction, but from testimonies locked away by intelligence agencies, later revealed like fragments of a hidden chronicle. This is not a tale with simple answers. It is an invitation to step into the gray zone where science collides with myth, and where history may stretch far beyond Earth. To follow this path is to risk wonder, skepticism, and awe in equal measure. It is the search for what might have been and what still could be. Welcome to Deformed History. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. It begins with a sealed envelope, an ordinary piece of paper carrying an extraordinary instruction. Mars, approximately 1 million years before Christ. The year was 1984, a time when the Cold War pushed governments into shadowed territories of research where science brushed against mysticism, and secrets were piled high in vaults. The CIA, better known for clandestine operations and the gathering of intelligence through satellites and spies, turned its gaze somewhere unimaginable, toward a planet glowing faintly in the night sky, not with rockets or telescopes, but with minds. Remote viewing, the term carried an air of mystic science, the suggestion that a person, placed in the right state of awareness, could pierce the veil of distance and describe what lay beyond ordinary senses. It was a field regarded by many as fringe, even ridiculous, yet taken seriously enough by those in power to justify experiments. One of those sessions, later declassified in the year 2000, offered a story that reads less like a sterile report and more like a fragment of forgotten myth. The monitor, the official guiding the session, did not say the word Mars out loud. He merely handed the subject, the viewer, a sealed envelope and asked him to focus. Coordinates were provided, numbers strung together like secret keys: 40, 89 degrees north, 955 degrees west. The subject closed his eyes and spoke. His words, preserved in the transcript, spill out with strange clarity. He said he saw something like pyramids, tall structures rising out of a wide depression. Smooth surfaces, massive stones, angles and walls that appeared deliberate. The image was vague, as though glimpsed through mist, yet precise enough to conjure recognition. The monitor pressed him forward, asking him to move across time. To that distant age marked on the card inside the envelope. Again, the subject spoke of monuments, of enormous markers, of shelters against storms. The voice in the transcript shifts between uncertainty and conviction, between someone unsure if he is describing a vision or a dream, but compelled to keep talking. This is the point where skepticism takes hold. How could anyone, with no prior knowledge, conjure pyramids on Mars? And why would the CIA be interested in such a vision? Yet one must remember the atmosphere of the era. The late 1970s and early 1980s were filled with speculation about Mars. In 1976, Viking 1 captured the now famous image of the so-called face on Mars, a mesa in the Cydonia region whose shadows and shapes suggested eyes, a nose, a mouth staring up at the universe. To some, it was nothing but a trick of light, pareidolia, the human mind inventing familiar patterns in random forms. To others, it was the first undeniable clue of an ancient civilization. Authors like Richard C. Hoagland amplified these suspicions, connecting them to pyramidal shapes spotted in the same region. The public imagination caught fire, and governments could not help but pay attention. The subject in the 1984 session described more than pyramids. He saw canyons with smooth, carved walls, as if nature had been reshaped by deliberate hands. He mentioned tall, slender beings, draped in silken garments, lying in vast chambers stripped of furniture, waiting for something to return, or perhaps for an ending they could not escape. These beings, in his vision, were ancient, philosophical in their resignation. They knew their world was collapsing, storms tearing across the land, an atmosphere thinning, water vanishing. Some of them, he said, departed in massive vessels, rounded walls gleaming like metal, seeking refuge on another world. The description veered into the surreal, yet it carried a tone that made the imagery strangely haunting, as though the witness were recounting not invention, but memory. When NASA's high-resolution images of those same coordinates are studied, what appears are mesas, craters, cliffs carved by dust storms, and the relentless hand of erosion. No pyramids, no monuments, no tall beings frozen in slumber. Science insists on geology. Yet the persistence of the alternative vision remains. The subject's testimony clings to the imagination because it reads like a myth transposed into modern language. Myths, after all, are not sterile inventions. They often grow from kernels of truth, warped by memory and magnified by retelling. Could it be that remote viewing tapped into something beyond coincidence? Or was it simply the echo of cultural imagery? The pyramids of Egypt, the obelisks of forgotten empires, projected onto the Martian landscape by a mind under suggestion? One detail continues to intrigue: the timing. By 1984, scientists already had broad maps of Mars, produced by Mariner 9 and Viking orbiters. They knew of the volcanoes, the valleys, the frozen poles. They had seen the face at Cydonia. It is not impossible that the subject had absorbed fragments of this cultural discourse unconsciously, weaving them into his vision without realizing. But there is also the matter of secrecy. The subject was never told the word Mars. The envelope remained sealed until after the session. So how did he speak of pyramids and obelisks and beings in crisis? Was it guesswork? Suggestion from the monitor's tone? Or a genuine psychic glimpse into a time and place none of us can truly know? The document declassified by the CIA does not attempt to answer. It simply preserves the exchange, leaving interpretation open. That ambiguity is precisely what fuels fascination. In the absence of certainty, imagination steps in. The very format of the transcript resembles a dialogue between the rational and the irrational, the possible and the implausible. A scientist might read it as evidence of subconscious projection. A believer might take it as proof of Martian civilization. A storyteller sees in it the bones of a lost epic, an Atlantis not beneath the sea, but across the gulf of space. There is another dimension worth considering. Human beings have always projected their hopes and fears onto the heavens. The Babylonians named the red point of light after Nergal, god of war and destruction. The Greeks and Romans transformed it into Ares and Mars, warriors eternal. To the Egyptians, the color red echoed blood and desert. Mars was never a neutral dot. It was always alive in our myths. So when a subject in 1984 described tall, gaunt Martians waiting in pyramids, he was unconsciously extending a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. He was giving new shape to an ancient pattern. The belief that Mars holds secrets, that it mirrors something about ourselves. The modern age cloaks such visions in the language of intelligence reports, coordinates, and transcripts, but the essence is unchanged. Whether through myth, fiction, or classified documents, Mars remains the canvas of our projections. Perhaps that is why the CIA file captures attention even now. It is not the accuracy of the description that matters. It is the possibility that someone, guided only by numbers on a page, reached into the past of another world and found echoes of a civilization facing its twilight. The truth may never be verifiable, but the story it weaves refuses to let go. In the end, the question is not whether pyramids exist on Mars. The question is why we continue to see them, why our minds conjure structures and beings in the dust of another planet. Maybe it is a reflection of our hunger to know we are not alone. Maybe it is the voice of our own mortality, whispering that civilizations can fall, whether on Earth or on a red desert far away. And maybe, just maybe, it is a memory left behind in the fabric of the cosmos, waiting for anyone willing to listen. The photograph that changed everything was not supposed to be more than another image catalogued in a long list of Martian landscapes. In 1976, Viking 1 snapped a frame of a plateau in Cydonia, and at first glance, the shadows and ridges appeared ordinary. But when one particular picture was enhanced and viewed at just the right angle, the human imagination seized on it instantly. There, staring back from the dusty surface, was a face. It had the proportions of a human countenance, eyes, nose, mouth, all sculpted not by an artist's hand, but seemingly by the very land itself. NASA initially dismissed the image as a trick of light, a coincidence of geology. Yet that single photograph leaked beyond scientific circles, flooding into tabloids, television specials, and books that spoke of lost civilizations. What if Mars had once been home to a people who carved their likeness into stone so large it could be seen from orbit? The idea seemed outrageous, and still it resonated, because humanity has always been moved by the notion of faces gazing back from the unknown. As more images emerged from the Viking orbiters, the fascination only deepened. Some saw pyramids clustered in the same region, angular shapes that resembled the ancient monuments of Giza. Authors wrote feverishly, suggesting a cosmic connection, that Earth and Mars were tied through a shared legacy of builders who understood geometry, astronomy, and permanence. Others looked at the data with more cautious eyes, pointing out that erosion and light can play tricks, creating familiar patterns out of random forms. This tendency has a name: pareidolia, the psychological impulse to perceive faces and designs where none exist. On Earth, people see saints in water stains, dragons in clouds, and castles in rocks. Why should Mars be any different? Yet the power of the Martian face was not in what it proved, but in what it suggested. Suddenly, the red planet was not just a lifeless rock, but a stage where the drama of forgotten epochs might have unfolded. By 1984, when the CIA conducted its remote viewing experiment, the face on Mars had already carved a niche in popular consciousness. Whether the subject of that session had ever studied those images remains unknown, but the coincidence is striking. He described pyramids, monuments, and beings struggling against catastrophe, elements that echoed the very narratives already brewing in the public imagination. Still, the mystery lingers. The monitor never uttered the word Mars, and yet the visions emerged. Was the subject channeling collective myth, or did he touch upon something real, something history has buried beneath dust and time? The power of symbols cannot be underestimated. Pyramids, after all, are not just piles of stone. On Earth, they have long been interpreted as stairways to eternity, structures aligned with the heavens, monuments built to endure across millennia. To transpose them onto Mars is to suggest continuity between worlds, as though civilizations across space reached for the same eternal design. The subject spoke of monuments resembling obelisks, long markers like the Washington Monument, rising as solitary sentinels on alien plains. These images spark questions that no photograph can silence. Why do we return again and again to the idea of deliberate structures out there? Perhaps because the thought of cosmic solitude feels unbearable, and pyramids on Mars would mean we share kinship across the stars. NASA, for its part, eventually captured sharper photographs. By the early 2000s, with the Mars Global Surveyor and later the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, high-resolution cameras stripped away the illusions. The so-called face lost its symmetry under new light, becoming clearly a natural mesa shaped by shadow. The supposed pyramids resolved into hills and ridges sculpted by erosion. For skeptics, this was the end of the debate. The monuments were mirages, nothing more. Yet for believers, the sharper images did not erase the mystery, but deepened it. Could advanced ruins weathered by ages still resemble natural forms? Could time itself conspire to disguise the truth beneath layers of dust? These questions linger because they appeal not to proof, but to wonder. And wonder has a gravity that science alone cannot dispel. The cultural backdrop is crucial here. Since the 19th century, Mars had been imagined as a world of canals, deserts, and civilizations. The Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli had mapped canali in the late 1800s, mistranslated into English as canals, igniting visions of an engineered planet. Percival Lowell expanded on this, insisting Mars was crisscrossed by vast waterways built to save a dying world. His lectures and writings captivated audiences, despite skeptical astronomers raising doubts. These stories fed into early science fiction, culminating in H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, where Martians invade Earth in desperate search of resources. By the mid-20th century, Ray Bradbury offered a more lyrical vision in The Martian Chronicles, where Mars became a stage for human longing and tragedy. Against this backdrop, the idea of pyramids and faces on Mars in the late 20th century was not an isolated oddity, but the latest chapter in a long tradition of imagining that world as inhabited. The CIA's remote viewing document fits seamlessly into this tapestry. Whether or not the subject truly saw Mars, his testimony resonates because it feels like an extension of stories humanity had already been telling itself for generations. He described storms tearing across barren plains, beings lying in slumber as their world collapsed, expeditions seeking refuge elsewhere. These are archetypes, civilizations falling, survivors scattering, monuments standing as testaments to vanished glory. On Earth, we tell such tales about Atlantis, about the Maya, about lost cities swallowed by jungle or sea. To tell them about Mars is to widen the horizon, to suggest that what happens here has happened elsewhere, that we are part of a repeating cosmic pattern. Of course, the scientific perspective remains unyielding. Mars is cold, dry, and thinly cloaked in atmosphere. Its rivers dried up billions of years ago. Its volcanoes are dormant, its magnetic shield gone. Yet even science admits there was a time, long ago, when Mars had lakes, oceans, and skies dense enough to cradle liquid water. For millions of years, it may have been a world not so different from Earth. Microbial life, at least, could have thrived there. If one accepts that, then it is not impossible to stretch further, to wonder if more complex forms ever rose and fell before the planet turned hostile. The leap is vast, but the human mind takes it eagerly, because in the silence of Mars we hear echoes of our own fragility. The face on Mars became a symbol not because it was true, but because it could be. It embodied the yearning for confirmation that we are not alone, that intelligence blooms in many places, that civilizations may rise, fall, and leave behind monuments written not in words, but in stone. To walk through that possibility is to step into a dream that feels older than science, a dream humanity has carried since the first time we looked up and wondered. And so, even as the high-resolution images declare geology, the myth persists, woven into culture, into whispers of conspiracy, into the strange experiments of intelligence agencies, into the very DNA of curiosity. Mars is not silent. It speaks in riddles, in shadows, in shapes that ignite questions. We may answer them with skepticism, with laughter, with disbelief, or with awe, but we cannot look away. The subject in that CIA room, eyes closed, describing pyramids and monuments, was tapping into that timeless current. Whether he glimpsed another reality, or only the depths of his imagination, the story remains, growing with every retelling. It is the beginning of a larger mystery, one that does not end with a photograph or a transcript, but continues to unfold in the restless human need to find meaning among the stars. There is a peculiar weight to stories that straddle the line between revelation and illusion, as though they exist in a twilight zone where disbelief is suspended, but wonder is never fully satisfied. The 1984 remote viewing transcript is precisely such a story. It does not declare itself fact, nor does it retreat into fiction. It lingers in the middle, daring us to decide for ourselves. When the subject was guided to new coordinates, he described vast canyons with sheer walls rising endlessly, carved so smooth they resembled architecture more than geology. He spoke of chambers within, halls stretching like labyrinths, ceilings vanishing into darkness. If he had been describing ruins on Earth, one might think of Petra, the city cut into sandstone cliffs, or of Egyptian tombs hidden beneath desert plateaus. But he was not describing Earth, at least not consciously. He was describing Mars, a place he believed he had entered with his mind alone. The monitor pressed him to move further, to new positions marked only by numbers. At one location he described a monumental marker, tall and solitary, covered with the weight of time, a structure he likened to the Washington Monument. The association was not trivial. Obelisks on Earth have long been symbols of power and endurance, from the granite spires of ancient Egypt to the pale stone tower in America's capital. To imagine such a form on Mars was to weave an immediate bridge between two worlds, as though humanity's instinct for monuments was mirrored in a civilization that preceded us by millions of years. The subject said the structure stood at the end of a great road, as though it marked the culmination of a journey, or perhaps the boundary between survival and collapse. He was then moved again, this time toward the southern reaches of Mars, coordinates that drew him to images of pyramids, many of them, large and small, clustered like sanctuaries against storms. The pyramids, he claimed, were shelters, hollowed out and stripped of decoration, serving only the function of refuge. Inside, he described figures, tall and slender, draped in garments like fitted silk. They were not busy, they were not building. They were lying down, waiting, conserving energy in a time of decline. His words carried a tone of mourning, as though he felt their resignation in his own body. They were not merely structures. They were tombs of a living people, suspended between hope and extinction. When asked by the monitor to describe what these beings awaited, the subject said they were looking for something to return, or someone to bring an answer. A portion of their population, he said, had left. They had taken vessels shaped like gleaming, rounded ships, larger than anything the mind could easily compare. These craft carried them away from their world of dust and storms to another planet, a place volatile but alive with vegetation and storms of a different kind. The image is haunting, an ancient exodus, a civilization splitting in two, one half entombed in their dying homeland, the other casting their fate upon the stars. At this point, the transcript reads like myth transcribed in bureaucratic language. The idea of beings departing a doomed world is not foreign to human imagination. In our myths, gods leave their mountain homes, Atlanteans sink beneath the ocean, and survivors scatter to repopulate the earth. The subject's vision places this myth not in legend, but on a real world, one that orbits the same sun as ours. Did he see memory, invention, or some echo embedded in the collective unconscious? The CIA document does not answer. It leaves the testimony bare, an open field for interpretation. Skeptics insist on simpler explanations. By 1984, maps of Mars were not secret. Anyone even casually exposed to the Viking images could have heard of the face, of strange formations that sparked speculation. Perhaps the subject, consciously or unconsciously, drew from these cultural impressions, weaving pyramids and obelisks into his trance. Perhaps his descriptions of tall beings mirrored the archetypal extraterrestrials of popular culture, the elegant and intelligent visitors depicted in films and books. The subconscious is a fertile field, capable of reshaping fragments of memory into convincing visions. And yet, despite these rational answers, the story clings to imagination like a burr to cloth. Because even if it was invention at precisely the right frequency to resonate with humanity's oldest questions. The beings he described were not invaders or conquerors. They were victims of catastrophe, struggling to endure as their environment betrayed them. The storms he mentioned align, in a poetic way, with what scientists believe happened to Mars. Billions of years ago, the planet lost its magnetic field. Without protection, the solar wind stripped its atmosphere, thinning it until liquid water could no longer survive on the surface. Oceans vanished, rivers carved their last paths, and the world turned cold and barren. The subject's words echo this narrative, a civilization struggling against environmental collapse, watching their skies darken and their air thin. It is easy to see why the account remains captivating. It matches scientific knowledge while extending it into myth. When the monitor asked if the beings recognized him, the subject answered that they did not know who he was. They saw him as an apparition, a ghost of sorts. The poignancy of that moment cannot be overlooked. A man sitting in a room on Earth, describing beings on Mars, claims those beings saw him as a ghost. It is a reversal of roles. Humans, forever seeking signs of extraterrestrials, are themselves perceived as the unreal. In that strange inversion lies a reflection of our own quest. We, too, search for meaning in the shadows, not certain whether what we see is real or just projection. The ships he described, those vast, rounded vessels, linger as some of the most striking imagery in the transcript. He said their walls were metallic, gleaming, enormous. Inside, they carried groups setting out to find a new home. The monitor urged him to follow, to see where they went. The subject described a place volatile with volcanic activity, filled with pockets of gas and lush vegetation. If one wished, it could be interpreted as Earth, in some primordial state, teeming with growth yet unstable, a world both hostile and fertile. The suggestion is almost too convenient. Martians fleeing their dying planet to seed life elsewhere, perhaps even here. It is the concept of panspermia, the migration of life across worlds, wrapped in the narrative of myth. Could it be coincidence that such a vision aligns with one of the oldest questions in science and philosophy? Where life began, and whether it travels from star to star? Or is it a demonstration of how myths adapt to fit scientific curiosity, cloaking themselves in new language but carrying the same essential story? The CIA did not say. They did not even officially interpret. They filed it, sealed it, and decades later released it to the public, where it became fuel for speculation, debate, and wonder. There is no way to test the accuracy of the subject's visions. Satellites show rocks and dust, rovers analyze soil and ice, but no monuments, no chambers, no tall beings. And yet, to dismiss the testimony outright is to ignore the way human imagination often precedes discovery. Once, myths spoke of lands across the ocean, and centuries later ships confirmed them. Once, stories spoke of worlds circling stars, and now telescopes catalog them by the thousands. Perhaps Mars holds nothing more than stone and dust, or perhaps beneath its surface lies evidence yet unseen. Until then, the transcript remains a story suspended between science and legend, waiting for those who dare to lean closer. The story of the face on Mars does not end with a single photograph taken in 1976. That grainy image from Viking 1 was only the spark, but the fire it ignited burned for decades, shaping both scientific inquiry and popular imagination. When the photograph was first released, it quickly spread beyond NASA's technical papers and into the wider culture. Newspapers featured it, magazines speculated wildly, and television programs suggested the possibility of ancient Martian builders. People looked at the dark patches that resembled eyes and the shadowed ridge that could be a nose, and felt the jolt of recognition, as if another intelligence had looked back at us across millions of miles. NASA, in its official tone, explained that the face was an illusion caused by lighting and topography, but by then the seed had already been planted. The public was fascinated not because the explanation was simple, but because the image suggested something far grander. proof that we were not alone. As the years passed, the photograph became iconic. Authors and researchers who were already drawn to mysteries began to publish books linking the face to pyramidal shapes nearby. They called the region Cydonia, not just as a geographical marker, but as a symbol of hidden knowledge. To them, the resemblance to Egyptian monuments was not coincidence, but a clue that Mars had once been home to a civilization parallel to the Nile Valley. Some suggested that builders from one planet may have influenced the other, that Earth and Mars were entwined through a shared lineage of cosmic architects. These ideas sounded fantastical, but their power lay in the connections they wove. Connections between planets, between myths, between science and speculation. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, these theories reached mainstream audiences. Richard C. Hoagland, a former NASA consultant, became one of the loudest voices promoting the notion of artificial structures on Mars. His presentations highlighted geometric patterns, angles, and alignments that he argued were too precise to be natural. He pointed to clusters of formations that resembled a city layout, claiming they reflected mathematical constants embedded in their design. To those inclined to believe, his work was a revelation. To skeptics, it was creative overreach, pattern-seeking gone wild. Yet whether one accepted or rejected his conclusions, it was undeniable that his arguments kept the mystery alive long after NASA thought it had been settled. NASA's later missions brought new evidence. In the 1990s, the Mars Global Surveyor began returning images of Cydonia with higher resolution. The once human face dissolved into a rugged mesa, its apparent features softened and scattered when seen from different angles and under different light. For scientists, this confirmed what they had always claimed. The face was an illusion. But the new images did not erase fascination. Instead, they fueled new rounds of speculation. Some argued that erosion and time could explain why an ancient monument now looked natural. Others claimed that NASA was selectively releasing images or downplaying anomalies to maintain control of the narrative. Distrust of authority, combined with the enduring allure of mystery, ensured that the debate would never fully end. The fascination with the face tapped into something primal. Humans are wired to recognize faces, a skill embedded in us for survival. To find a face in stone is to feel presence where none exists, to experience the uncanny sense that we are being watched. On Earth, ancient cultures carved faces into cliffs, mountains, and temples as a way to anchor identity into the landscape. When we see a face on Mars, even by accident, it resonates with that long tradition. We cannot help but ask, who carved it? What message does it send? Even if logic tells us it is only stone, the heart insists on imagining otherwise. Cydonia became a stage upon which these dramas of belief played out. Alongside the face, other formations gained attention. Angular hills that seemed like pyramids, rectangular plateaus that resembled foundations. Books and documentaries spoke of a lost Martian civilization, one that may have thrived billions of years ago when the planet still had rivers and seas. They imagined a culture of architects and astronomers who watched their world die and perhaps reached across space to Earth. This idea, though unsupported by physical evidence, fed a hunger for stories of connection. For many, the thought that humanity's ancestors might have Martian origins was not absurd, but exhilarating. Meanwhile, skeptics sharpened their arguments. They pointed to pareidolia, the psychological tendency to see meaningful shapes in randomness. They reminded audiences that lighting conditions could drastically change how features appear in photographs. They emphasized that erosion, wind, and geology can create straight lines and sharp angles without any guiding hand. To them, the allure of the face was proof not of aliens, but of human imagination's power to deceive itself. Yet even as they explained, they could not erase the image from public consciousness. It remained in books, in art, in films, and in countless conversations about whether we were alone. When high-resolution images from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter finally offered a clear, unambiguous view of the region, the debate should have ended. The face was undeniably a natural formation, a mountain scarred by cracks and ridges. But by then, the mystery had grown larger than the data. The face had become symbolic, representing the possibility of hidden truths and suppressed knowledge. People no longer argued solely about geology. They argued about trust, about whether official explanations could be believed, about the human right to wonder beyond sanctioned boundaries. The photograph had transformed into a myth, and myths are not erased by pixels. The remote viewing transcript from 1984 sits within this same atmosphere. When the subject described pyramids and monuments, his words echoed the cultural storm already swirling around Mars. Perhaps he absorbed these ideas unconsciously, projecting them into his vision. Or perhaps, as some believe, he tapped into something real, glimpsing truths obscured by time and denial. The coincidence that he described pyramids at coordinates not far from the face only strengthens the connection. The transcript becomes less a curiosity and more a puzzle piece, fitting into a larger pattern of stories, images, and suspicions. In the end, the face on Mars may be nothing but stone. But its significance lies not in what it is, but in what it represents. It is a mirror reflecting our own longing to discover others, our fear of isolation, and our instinct to seek meaning in the void. That is why the debate has endured, and why the image continues to inspire books, films, and conspiracies decades later. Mars remains a silent canvas, and we continue to paint our hopes and fears upon it. Whether the face is an illusion or a monument, its legacy is the same. It has kept us looking up, searching, and imagining. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is its true purpose. When the subject of the 1984 session described the beings he saw within the Martian shelters, his words carried a resonance that felt almost biblical. He did not speak of small, gray figures with oversized heads, the archetype familiar from UFO lore, but of tall, slender people, graceful and fragile in their proportions. Their garments clung like fine silk, not flowing loosely but fitted, as though designed for both elegance and function. They were lying down, weary, waiting. It was not the image of a bustling society, but of a civilization on the edge of collapse, caught between remembrance and resignation. The sadness in his words was palpable, as if he himself had been burdened with their despair. He said they were ancient, not just in age, but in spirit, as though they carried the wisdom of countless generations. Yet all their philosophy, all their knowledge, had not saved them from the decline of their world. This description of tall beings invites questions, not just about Mars, but about the way humans imagine life beyond Earth. Popular culture of the 20th century often portrayed extraterrestrials as tall, elegant, almost angelic. From pulp magazines to films, The motif of the elongated alien carried associations of intelligence, fragility, and otherness. In contrast to monstrous invaders, these figures seemed closer to gods or prophets, messengers from the stars rather than conquerors. Perhaps the subject's imagination drew upon these archetypes, embedding them into his vision. But another possibility lingers, that such images repeat across culture because they touch on something deeper, something older than memory, perhaps even a trace embedded in human myth. The beings, according to his account, were not thriving. They were waiting for something to return, or for a solution that never came. They seemed aware of their impending extinction, but faced it with a stoic calm. He spoke of them as philosophical, resigned, not panicked, but contemplative. It is a striking picture, one that echoes the fall of many civilizations on Earth. When drought struck the Maya, when Rome crumbled under its own weight, when empires saw the tide of history turn against them, their final years often carried the same mix of denial, resistance, and weary acceptance. The Martians of the transcript fit into this pattern, a people watching the end of their age, powerless to change it, yet determined to endure in memory if not in body. The conditions he described match, in poetic form, what science tells us about Mars. The storms, the thinning atmosphere, the vanishing water, all align with the known history of the planet. Billions of years ago, Mars was warm and wet, with lakes and perhaps oceans. But as its magnetic field weakened, solar winds stripped away the air, and the climate shifted into the cold desert we see today. For any life that might have existed, the transition would have been catastrophic. The subject's vision compresses this immense geological story into human terms, transforming planetary processes into the lived experience of beings caught in the collapse. It is as if he translated science into myth without realizing it. The most haunting part of his account was the Exodus. He said some of the beings left their planet in massive ships, rounded and metallic, shimmering with reflective surfaces. Inside, they carried groups chosen to search for a new home. He described the sensation of traveling with them, glimpsing another world alive with vegetation, volatile and unstable, but rich in possibility. To many readers, this description sounds like Earth itself, long ago, in an age when volcanoes still roared and forests stretched wild. Could it be that his vision suggested Martians escaping to Earth, carrying with them the seeds of life, or even the ancestors of humanity? It is the hypothesis of directed panspermia, the idea that intelligent beings may have seeded life deliberately on other worlds. It is also a story that echoes myths from countless cultures, myths of gods descending from the sky to teach humans, to shape civilizations, to blend their blood with ours. Skeptics argue, of course, that this is projection. By 1984, panspermia was already a concept known in scientific and speculative circles. The idea of extraterrestrials influencing human origins had been popularized by books like Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods in the 1960s. The subject could have absorbed these notions, consciously or unconsciously, and woven them into his vision. But the coincidence remains powerful. His words tied together the scientific reality of Mars's decline, the mythic imagery of tall, noble beings, and the enduring speculation about humanity's cosmic ancestry. That fusion is why the transcript continues to provoke fascination. It reads like a bridge between science, myth, and conspiracy, leaving enough ambiguity to invite belief. The image of the tall Martians resonates also because of their vulnerability. They were not depicted as all-powerful masters, but as survivors, fragile against forces larger than themselves. This vulnerability makes them relatable. We, too, live on a planet whose climate is shifting, whose resources can be exhausted, whose future is uncertain. To imagine Martians waiting in silence as their world crumbled is to confront our own potential fate. Their story becomes a cautionary tale, reminding us that no civilization, no matter how advanced, is immune to collapse. The transcript's power lies not in proving Martian life, but in weaving a narrative that touches human archetypes. The beings are tall because they live in lighter gravity, the subject suggested. They wear fitted garments because function outweighs ornament in survival. They lie in empty chambers because luxury has vanished and only necessity remains. Every detail fits the story of decline, of dignity preserved in the face of inevitability. Whether invented or seen, the vision endures because it tells us not just about Mars, but about ourselves. And yet, what if it were true? What if a civilization once thrived on Mars, built monuments, endured storms, and finally reached out to the stars? What if their exodus left traces, not only on other planets, but in our own myths, our own bloodlines? To entertain this possibility is to widen history beyond Earth, to imagine that humanity is not the first chapter, but merely the continuation of a saga written across worlds. The tall beings of the transcript would then be not strangers, but distant kin, their sorrow echoing through us because we carry fragments of their story within. Science has found no evidence of such beings. Rovers roam the Martian surface, photographing rocks and drilling into soil, searching for microbial fossils rather than civilizations. The official record speaks of dust, ice, and the faint trace of methane in the air. But the absence of evidence is not the end of imagination. Myths do not require proof to endure. They survive because they touch something essential, because they give shape to the questions we are not ready to silence. The tall Martians, whether real or imagined, are now part of that mythology. They live in the words of a transcript once hidden in a government archive, in the whispers of documentaries, in the speculative chapters of books that question the official story. They stand as symbols of fragility, resilience, and the enduring human dream of connection beyond Earth. Perhaps that is their true legacy. Not the monuments of stone, not the ships of metal, but the story that continues to ripple through us, reminding us that the universe may hold more histories than we can count, and that some of those histories may be closer to our own than we dare admit. The notion of monuments on Mars refuses to vanish, no matter how many times scientists present high-resolution images of barren mesas and wind-carved hills. The human mind is drawn to symbols, and one of the most compelling that emerged from the 1984 transcript was the description of an obelisk, a great marker rising vertically at the end of a massive road. The subject compared it to the Washington Monument, a structure that itself was modeled after ancient Egyptian obelisks. These towering spires have always carried associations of power, memory, and continuity. In Egypt, they were inscribed with hieroglyphs to honor gods and kings, intended to pierce the heavens with a shaft of stone that would outlast centuries. On Earth, even in modern cities, they stand as emblems of endurance. To hear one described on Mars was to connect two worlds through a shared language of stone, as though civilizations separated by planets spoke in the same architectural tongue. Skeptics quickly point out that natural formations can mimic such shapes. A pillar of rock left behind after erosion, an angular ridge thrust up by tectonic stress, or a mesa viewed under unusual light could all resemble an obelisk. Mars is full of such oddities, formations sculpted by billions of years of wind and dust. And yet the idea lingers. The transcript did not describe just any stone. It spoke of a monumental marker, as if deliberately placed to signify an ending or a beginning. The metaphor of a road leading to such a marker deepens the symbolism. Roads imply intention, direction, and journeys completed. To imagine one on Mars is to imagine not random geology, but purpose, a narrative carved into the landscape. The fascination with Martian monuments fits neatly into a broader human pattern. Across cultures, we project meaning onto shapes that stand alone. Stonehenge rises from Salisbury Plain and invites speculation about astronomy and ritual. The Moai statues of Easter Island gaze outward with silent authority, their builder's purpose still debated. The pyramids of Giza loom as eternal mysteries of engineering and faith. When we see a solitary stone rising on another planet, even if by chance, our instinct is to treat it as message rather than accident. We cannot help but search for connection in the mute geometry of nature. This instinct, however, carries the risk of pareidolia, the same psychological quirk that makes us see faces in clouds and animals in the stars. The human brain is a pattern-recognizing engine, trained for survival to detect significance even in ambiguous stimuli. Better to mistake a shadow for a predator than to miss the real thing. On Mars, this instinct runs unchecked. Photographs of its surface are filled with ridges, cracks, and formations that, in a fleeting moment, resemble familiar shapes. A rock shaped like a doorway, a hill that looks like a fortress, a patch of light that mimics a bone. Each new image sparks speculation, shared and amplified in media eager for mystery. The obelisk described in the transcript fits this pattern, an imagined structure that feels deliberate, even if it is only erosion. But why does this matter? Why do we insist on seeing monuments where none may exist? Perhaps because monuments are how civilizations speak across time. They are messages carved not in fragile words, but in stone, intended to survive when languages and empires collapse. To imagine monuments on Mars is to imagine a civilization that wished to be remembered, one that reached across eons to leave proof of its existence. Such an idea is irresistible because it validates our hope that intelligence is not unique to Earth. It tells us that others have lived, struggled, and sought permanence in the same way we do. In the transcript, the obelisk stood at the end of a great road, as though marking a destination. This image resonates with myth as much as with archaeology. Roads have always symbolized journeys, pilgrimages, migrations, lifelines of trade. To end a road with a monument is to declare arrival, to say, here lies the meaning of the path. On Earth, sacred roads often culminated in temples or shrines. To place an obelisk at the end of a Martian road suggests ritual, memory, or perhaps a warning. The subject's vision, whether real or imagined, transforms barren coordinates into a story of movement and arrival, of civilizations that did not simply exist, but sought to tell us something. When modern spacecraft imaged the same region at higher resolution, they revealed no such monument. The surface was littered with rocks, ridges, and craters, but nothing matched the description of a Washington-like obelisk. To most, this settled the matter. To others, it opened new layers of speculation. Perhaps erosion had disguised the structure, burying it beneath dust. Perhaps time had toppled it, leaving only fragments. Or perhaps, more conspiratorially, images were withheld or altered to prevent public knowledge. The absence of evidence, paradoxically, became fuel for belief. The less we saw, the more we imagined. The Washington Monument itself is an interesting choice for comparison. Built in the 19th century, it was intended as a tribute to endurance and leadership, rising above the American Capitol as a secular shrine. Its shape, however, reaches much further back. It echoes Egyptian obelisks that were themselves symbols of the sun's rays solidified in stone. To liken a Martian monument to such a structure is to situate it within a lineage of meaning. Stone as memory, height as aspiration, permanence as defiance against time. The subject may have chosen the comparison unconsciously, but it binds the imagined Martian obelisk to humanity's deepest architectural archetypes. Even if the monument was never real, the power of the description lies in what it evokes. It becomes a metaphor for the way humans approach Mars itself. The planet is an endpoint, a marker at the road's end of exploration. For centuries we have traveled mentally across the void, sending probes and dreams alike, and Mars has waited like a silent obelisk on the horizon. It is not coincidence that we treat our own missions to Mars as monumental events, planting flags in soil as if to echo ancient rites. The obelisk, real or imagined, is already part of our dialogue with the planet. One could argue that myths function in much the same way as monuments. They endure, not in stone, but in story, transmitting values and warnings across generations. The Martian obelisk of the transcript, even if never carved, now stands as a mythic marker in human imagination. It tells us that we crave continuity, that we need to believe civilizations rise and leave their trace, and that we ourselves are engaged in the same act of memory-making. Every satellite we launch, every rover we land is our way of leaving obelisks for those who may come after. The skeptic will always remind us, Mars is dust, rock, and ice, not temples and roads. But myth does not vanish under skepticism. It adapts, reshaping itself as metaphor, if not as fact. The obelisk described in 1984 has already become such a metaphor. It is the marker of our own desire to believe, our refusal to accept silence from the stars. Whether or not it ever stood on Martian soil, it stands firmly in the architecture of our imagination, pointing upward, telling us to keep looking, keep questioning, and keep walking the road that ends not in answers, but in wonder. The remote viewing transcript never reveals who the subject was, and perhaps that anonymity is part of what makes the story endure. Without a name, the figure becomes archetypal, less a single person, and more a vessel for human imagination itself. Still, speculation has swirled for years. Some suggest that the subject could have been Ingo Swann, a pioneer of remote viewing who claimed to have described the rings of Jupiter before they were confirmed by spacecraft. Others point to Joseph McMoneagle, a retired U.S. Army intelligence officer who later spoke publicly about his involvement in Project Stargate, the classified program that tested psychic perception for intelligence purposes. Neither man ever claimed outright to be the one behind the Martian transcript, but their reputations circle it like shadows, reminding us that such experiments were not idle fantasies, but real projects funded and conducted at the height of the Cold War. To understand why the CIA would even consider such ideas, we have to step back into the atmosphere of the 1970s and 1980s. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a struggle for dominance that reached far beyond missiles and armies. Each superpower feared that the other might gain an unexpected edge, not only through technology, but through unconventional science. Reports filtered westward that the Soviets were investing heavily in psychic research, exploring telepathy, psychokinesis, and remote perception. Whether those reports were exaggerated or not mattered less than the fact that American officials believed them. In that environment, no possibility could be dismissed out of hand. If the Soviets were attempting to weaponize the mind, then the CIA felt compelled to test it as well. Out of this paranoia grew a series of programs: Grill Flame, Sunstreak, Center Lane, and finally Stargate. These projects explored the strange idea that human consciousness might reach beyond the body to perceive distant places, objects, or even points in time. Volunteers were trained to quiet their minds, focus on target coordinates, and sketch or describe what they saw. Sometimes their impressions matched reality closely enough to raise eyebrows. At other times, they wandered into fantasy or error. But the tantalizing hits kept funding alive for years. By the mid-1980s, the program had matured enough that the CIA and military intelligence began to test more ambitious targets. And what could be more ambitious than Mars? It is worth noting that the experiment was structured carefully to avoid suggestion. The subject was handed a sealed envelope that contained the word Mars and the time frame 1 million years BC. The monitor never said those words aloud. Instead, he offered only coordinates, a set of numbers that in ordinary life would mean nothing. Yet the subject responded with visions of pyramids, monuments, beings, and storms. This setup was deliberate. If the subject described something extraordinary, it could not easily be blamed on conscious bias. Of course, skeptics argue that the subject might have guessed or drawn subconsciously on prior knowledge. The face on Mars had been public since 1976, and speculation about Martian ruins was already circulating in fringe circles. Perhaps the subject had read about these things, forgotten them consciously, and then resurrected them in the trance-like state of remote viewing. But the sheer vividness of the account, the beings in silk, the ships of gleaming metal, the atmosphere of resignation, lifts it beyond the mundane. The question of identity matters because credibility hinges on it. If the subject was a trained and respected remote viewer like Swan or McMonigal, then believers see the account as more authoritative. If it was an unknown recruit, the transcript may carry less weight, but anonymity also shields it from easy dismissal. We cannot reduce it to one man's imagination because we do not know which man it was. The story remains suspended, like the monuments it describes, resisting clear attribution. What we do know is that remote viewing was taken seriously enough to receive government funding for over 2 decades. Stargate and its predecessors consumed millions of dollars and produced thousands of pages of transcripts. Some sessions were said to have aided in locating hostages or describing hidden facilities. Others were failures, producing nonsense or vague impressions that could not be verified. Eventually, in the 1990s, the program was declassified and declared of no practical value. Yet the very fact of its existence is remarkable. Intelligence agencies, staffed by rational men and women in suits, spent years exploring psychic phenomena, convinced that secrecy and rigor might reveal powers ignored by conventional science. In that light, the 1984 Mars session appears less like an oddity and more like a natural extension of the program's ambitions. If remote viewing could peer into enemy compounds, why not test whether it could reach across planets or centuries? To the CIA, the cost of such an experiment was minimal, the potential reward infinite. If even a fragment of truth emerged, it would change history. And if nothing emerged, it could be filed away quietly, another classified curiosity lost in the archives. For decades, it was indeed hidden, until the year 2000, when the document was released along with a flood of other Stargate materials. By then, the Cold War had ended, and the urgency had faded. What remained was the strangeness of the testimony, preserved in black and white text, like the fragment of a forgotten legend. The secrecy of the subject's identity mirrors the secrecy of the program itself. For years, even the existence of remote viewing projects was denied. Researchers signed non-disclosure agreements, files were locked in secure vaults, and those who participated often faced ridicule if they spoke publicly. To be involved was to live in a twilight world, part science, part mysticism, part espionage. The men and women who sat in quiet rooms, sketching impressions of distant sights, must have felt the weight of both ridicule and awe. They were explorers in a landscape without maps, asked to cross distances with the mind alone. Some believed deeply in their gift. Others saw themselves as test subjects, willing but skeptical. The Mars transcript captures that atmosphere perfectly. It is not written in the language of fiction, but in the terse exchange of an intelligence interview. Describe the location. What do you see? Move to the next coordinates. The formality heightens the surreal content. It reads like minutes from a meeting with another world, a bureaucratic record of myth. The anonymity of the subject, the neutrality of the monitor, the precision of the coordinates, all these lend the account a strange authenticity, even as the content strains belief. Skeptics remind us that none of this proves anything about Mars. The identity of the subject cannot be confirmed, and even if it could, credibility would still rest on faith in remote viewing itself, a phenomenon unverified by mainstream science. The CIA itself, after years of testing, concluded that the data were too inconsistent for practical use. And yet, the Mars session remains a jewel among the declassified files, one of the few that reaches beyond Earth, beyond time, into the realm of cosmic speculation. Its persistence in public imagination shows that sometimes the story is more powerful than the conclusion. Whether the subject was Swan, McMoneagle, or an unknown soldier hardly matters anymore. What matters is the vision. Pyramids in the dust, obelisks pointing skyward, beings draped in silk waiting for rescue that never came. The transcript is anonymous, but in that anonymity, it becomes universal. The voice could be anyone's. It could even be ours, speaking from a place of longing, translating the silence of Mars into words we can understand. And perhaps that is why the document survives as more than a curiosity. It is not simply about who saw, but about what was seen and what we choose to believe when faced with a story too strange to dismiss and too human to forget. By the time the Viking orbiters swept around Mars in the late 1970s, humanity had already been primed for revelation. For centuries we had stared at the red dot in the sky, imagining canals, civilizations, and desperate survivors carving waterways through a dying world. The Viking mission was supposed to end speculation by giving us clear photographs and hard science. Instead, it opened the door to new mysteries. The images of Cydonia, with their suggestive shapes, became seeds for speculation that no amount of scientific caution could uproot. Among them were angular hills that seemed to form pyramids, massive triangular formations standing in eerie symmetry. To the trained geologist, they were mesas and buttes sculpted by wind. To those hungry for mystery, they were unmistakably deliberate. Magazines and books published blown-up images of these formations, tracing their edges with rulers, measuring angles and ratios, and claiming evidence of geometry too precise for nature. The words "pyramids of Mars" began to circulate in popular culture, capturing the imagination of anyone who had ever wondered whether humanity was truly alone. The comparison to Egyptian pyramids was inevitable. Here on Earth, the Giza Plateau had long stood as a monument to human ingenuity and cosmic aspiration. To see similar forms on another planet suggested connection, a bridge across space and time. Were the Martian pyramids older cousins of Giza? Were they built by the same mysterious builders that legends hinted at? Scientists responded with patience at first, then frustration. They explained how erosion could create triangular shapes, how shadows at low sun angles exaggerate geometry, how the mind plays tricks when searching for familiar patterns. They emphasized the need for high-resolution images before drawing conclusions. Yet their explanations rarely satisfied the public. Once the idea of Martian pyramids took root, it became more than a question of geology. It became a symbol of suppressed knowledge, of secrets too dangerous to admit, of mysteries waiting to be revealed. For many, skepticism was interpreted not as rationality, but as denial, a refusal to look honestly at the evidence. The power of the pyramid as a symbol cannot be overstated. Unlike obelisks or statues, pyramids appear across multiple cultures on Earth, from Egypt to Mesoamerica to ancient China. Their shape is simple yet enduring, resistant to erosion and collapse, pointing upward as if to connect earth and sky. They embody permanence. When people saw pyramid-like formations on Mars, they did not just see rocks. They saw echoes of a universal design. Whether by coincidence or intention, the shapes resonated with something deep in human consciousness. They suggested that intelligence, wherever it arises, might converge on the same forms, the same monumental language of stone. Writers and researchers took these ideas further, weaving them into elaborate theories. Some suggested that an ancient Martian civilization had flourished billions of years ago, building pyramids and monuments before their world succumbed to catastrophe. Others proposed that survivors of this civilization had migrated to Earth, influencing the rise of our own pyramid-building cultures. This was not science as the mainstream defined it, but myth-making in modern clothing, a blending of archaeology, astronomy, and longing. To believers, the lack of direct evidence was not a flaw, but a challenge, a mystery demanding further exploration. The fascination with Martian pyramids grew precisely because it echoed humanity's own sense of fragility. If Mars once hosted a thriving civilization that later perished, then the red planet becomes both a mirror and a warning. Civilizations rise, achieve greatness, and fall, whether on Earth or elsewhere. The pyramids, standing in silence, would be the last whispers of a world that once dreamed as we do. This narrative fit neatly into our cultural memory, reinforcing myths of Atlantis, of lost empires swallowed by sea or sand, of builders whose works outlasted their names. Mars became another chapter in that story. When later missions returned sharper images, the supposed pyramids lost much of their mystery. What had looked like crisp edges were revealed as natural ridges. Symmetry dissolved under scrutiny. But by then, the myth had taken on a life of its own. For every new image that debunked, there were believers ready to reinterpret. Perhaps the pyramids had eroded. Perhaps NASA was hiding the clearest photos. Perhaps truth was too destabilizing to reveal. The more scientists explained, the more some audiences distrusted them, convinced that authority itself was part of the cover-up. Thus, the pyramids of Mars became not only a geological question, but a cultural battleground over trust, secrecy, and the right to wonder. The 1984 remote viewing transcript fed directly into this atmosphere. The subject's description of pyramids used as shelters against storms echoed what many already believed, that Mars had once hosted monumental structures. Whether the subject had prior knowledge of these theories or not, his words aligned with them uncannily. He spoke of pyramids not as symbols of worship, but as practical refuges, stripped of ornament, built to endure in a hostile environment. That detail gave his account a stark realism. These were not ceremonial monuments, but lifeboats of stone, desperate attempts to survive a world in collapse. In that sense, his vision blended the grandeur of myth with the harshness of survival, making it all the more compelling. The debate over the pyramids continues to this day, though in quieter tones. High-resolution cameras have left little doubt for most scientists that the formations are natural. Yet in corners of the internet, in books and late-night radio, the idea refuses to die. People continue to trace lines on satellite photos, to argue over geometry, to claim alignments with stars or ancient Earth monuments. The pyramids of Mars have become part of modern folklore, an enduring story that sits alongside UFOs, lost continents, and the mysteries of ancient builders. Their persistence speaks to the human need for wonder, for narratives that stretch beyond the known, for the possibility that we are part of a cosmic history larger than ourselves. Ultimately, the pyramids of Mars are less about rocks and more about meaning. They are symbols of the way humans confront the unknown, by projecting stories, by seeking patterns, by building bridges of imagination between ourselves and the stars. Whether they are mere mesas or the ruins of an ancient civilization, their role in our culture is the same. They invite us to look closer, to question, to dream. And perhaps that is the most important monument of all. Not stone rising from Martian dust, but the enduring tower of curiosity rising within us, pointing upward, refusing to settle, forever seeking the truth in shapes half buried by shadow. Remote viewing might sound like a strange detour in the story of Mars, but it is inseparable from the Cold War mindset that gave birth to it. In the early 1970s, when the world was divided into two hostile blocks, information was as valuable as weapons. The United States and the Soviet Union spied on one another relentlessly, chasing every possible advantage, no matter how unorthodox. It was in this tense climate that whispers emerged. Soviet scientists were experimenting with psychic research, testing the ability of human minds to see beyond distance, to move objects without touch, to send thoughts across miles. These reports were difficult to verify, but they were enough to stir anxiety. If there was even a small chance that the Soviets could harness such powers, the Americans could not risk falling behind. And so, with secrecy and funding, the CIA opened its own door into this world, a door that would eventually lead them to Mars. The Stanford Research Institute in California became the unlikely cradle of this exploration. Two physicists, Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, began testing subjects who claimed unusual perception. They developed a protocol. A person, isolated in a quiet room, would be given only coordinates or a sealed envelope and asked to describe a distant target. Sketches, words, impressions flowed. Sometimes the results were vague, mere scribbles. Other times they were startlingly specific, details of buildings, landscapes, or objects that seemed to align with reality. The CIA took notice. Funding increased. Soon, the program was no longer a fringe curiosity, but a classified project with serious attention. By the mid-1970s, the United States military had joined in. Army intelligence officers trained as remote viewers, their sessions carefully logged and compared against real-world data. The names of these projects changed as they moved between agencies: Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak. But their purpose remained the same: to see what could not be seen. The results were mixed, and skeptics argued that hits could be explained by chance or by vague descriptions interpreted generously after the fact. Yet there were enough moments of uncanny accuracy to keep the program alive. In one case, a viewer described the inside of a Soviet submarine under construction, with details later confirmed by satellite. In another, a hostage's location was sketched with surprising resemblance to the actual site. Such successes fueled belief, even if they were never consistent enough to be relied upon. It was within this climate of possibility that the leap to Mars occurred. If remote viewers could describe enemy facilities on Earth, why not test their ability to reach further? A planet millions of miles away provided the ultimate challenge. If anything meaningful emerged, it could change the very definition of intelligence. The 1984 session was one such test. Officially, it was only another entry in the experiment log, an attempt to stretch the boundaries of human perception. Unofficially, it was a bold step into territory that blurred science and myth, espionage and imagination. Skeptics often frame the program as a costly detour fueled by paranoia. After all, in 1995, when the CIA finally declassified the project, an evaluation by the American Institutes for Research concluded that remote viewing had not provided actionable intelligence. To most scientists, the phenomenon remained unproven, its successes explained by chance, bias, or creative interpretation. Yet the fact remains. For more than 2 decades, serious resources were devoted to it. Men and women sat in quiet rooms, describing places they had never visited, guided only by coordinates, while trained monitors recorded their every word. This was not science fiction. It was part of the machinery of intelligence at the height of global tension. The secrecy of the program added to its mystique. When documents were finally released, they revealed not only mundane sessions describing airfields or storage facilities, but also extraordinary ones that leapt into the unknown. Among them was the Mars transcript, a record so unusual it seemed to belong more to mythology than to espionage. But it was typed on government paper, preserved in the same archive as serious intelligence reports, stamped with the weight of bureaucracy. That paradox, myth dressed in official ink, is what gives the transcript its enduring power. The involvement of respected figures lent further credibility. Ingo Swann, for example, was said to have described the rings of Jupiter before the Voyager spacecraft confirmed them. Joseph McMoneagle, another participant, later received commendations for his service and spoke openly about his belief in remote viewing's potential. These men were not anonymous mystics, but professionals whose work intersected with national security. If they believed in what they saw, it was harder to dismiss their accounts outright. Still, the line between belief and evidence remained thin. The CIA never claimed that remote viewing proved the existence of Martian civilizations. What they had was testimony, vivid but unverifiable. The Mars session was filed away, not as proof of aliens, but as data from an experiment. Only when the Cold War ended and the veil of secrecy lifted did the public glimpse its contents. By then, decades of speculation about Martian faces and pyramids had primed audiences to see the transcript not as curiosity but as revelation. The story of remote viewing reflects a deeper truth about human nature. We are unwilling to close the door on possibility. Even when science casts doubt, even when logic insists otherwise, the hunger to believe persists. For the CIA, that hunger was shaped by fear that the Soviets might weaponize the mind. For the public, it is shaped by wonder, the hope that we are not alone, that hidden knowledge awaits discovery. The Mars transcript exists at the intersection of those impulses. A strange artifact born from paranoia, but sustained by imagination. Today, Project Stargate and its predecessors are often cited as examples of Cold War eccentricity, experiments that reveal the lengths governments will go in pursuit of advantage. But to dismiss them entirely misses the point. The human mind is drawn to the edges of knowledge, to the gray areas where fact and belief blur. Remote viewing, whether real or illusory, offered a glimpse into that borderland. The Mars session, with its pyramids, monuments, and slender beings, is not just about intelligence gathering. It is about the refusal to accept limits, the drive to see beyond, the ancient dream of touching the unknown. The Cold War has ended, but the transcript remains, a relic of a time when fear and wonder drove agencies to chase shadows across space. It tells us as much about ourselves as it does about Mars. We are creatures who look for patterns, who invest in mysteries, who are willing to believe that a closed envelope and a quiet mind might unlock the secrets of another world. Whether those secrets are real or imagined is almost secondary. What matters is that for one moment, in 1984, a man sitting in a secure room closed his eyes, and in his words, Mars came alive with monuments, storms, and ancient beings waiting in silence. That moment still echoes, reminding us that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin not with rockets, but with imagination, reaching further than science dares, into the realm where myth and memory entwine. Why would the CIA, an agency tasked with gathering concrete intelligence, spend time exploring visions of pyramids and beings on Mars? The official answer has never been given, and perhaps that silence fuels the mystery more than any revelation could. To understand their motives, one must place the experiment in its broader context. In 1984, the scientific picture of Mars was already detailed enough to spark wonder, but not yet resolved enough to silence speculation. The Viking missions had mapped nearly the entire planet. They had shown volcanoes taller than any on Earth, canyons that dwarfed the Grand Canyon, and polar caps that shifted with the seasons. They had also photographed Cydonia, where shadows conspired to create the famous face. For the scientific community, these were fascinating geological features. For those with different inclinations, they were potential ruins, signs of a civilization lost to time. The CIA, working in shadows, had a different set of priorities. Intelligence is not only about what is true, but about what others might believe to be true. If there was even the faintest possibility that Mars held evidence of intelligence, past or present, it might have strategic implications. Imagine the global reaction if undeniable proof of extraterrestrial civilization were discovered. Religions would be shaken, political ideologies tested, scientific paradigms rewritten. In such a scenario, knowledge was power. To be the first agency with even speculative data on the subject could be considered valuable. Remote viewing, in this sense, was not just a curiosity. It was a potential tool to probe the unknown without risk, a low-cost gamble that might yield extraordinary rewards. Another possibility is that the CIA was not searching for answers about Mars itself, but about remote viewing's potential. Mars, distant and inaccessible, provided the perfect target for a clean test. On Earth, remote viewers might unconsciously draw on prior knowledge of geography or landmarks. But no one had ever walked on Mars. If a subject described something later confirmed by spacecraft, that would be remarkable evidence of the phenomenon's validity. The choice of Mars may have been less about aliens and more about methodology, a way to test the mind against the most unreachable of places. Yet, ironically, the content of the session was so extraordinary that it overshadowed any methodological lesson. Instead of confirming or refuting remote viewing, the transcript fueled a myth that still endures. There is also the more speculative angle, the idea that the CIA, or at least some within it, already suspected more about Mars than they admitted. Conspiratorial whispers suggest that artifacts or knowledge had been uncovered on Earth, perhaps even through recovered craft or ancient sites that hinted at Martian connections. If true, then the 1984 session was not random curiosity, but a targeted attempt to gather additional data, however unconventional. This theory gains fuel from the timing. By the mid-1980s, speculation about ancient astronauts and extraterrestrial influence on human history was widespread. The public consumed books, documentaries, and films that blended archaeology with science fiction. Was the CIA simply curious, or were they probing deeper, looking for confirmation of suspicions too volatile to voice openly? The absence of an official explanation leaves space for all these interpretations. What remains undeniable is the sheer oddity of the transcript. The subject's words, preserved with bureaucratic precision, describe not just landscapes but narratives, beings struggling, monuments standing, civilizations collapsing. This goes far beyond what one would expect from a controlled experiment. If the CIA wanted to test remote viewing against distant geography, they could have asked the subject to describe mountains, craters, or valleys. Instead, what emerged was myth wrapped in vision. Whether the agency valued these descriptions or dismissed them is unknown. But by releasing the document decades later, they ensured that the myth would survive, moving from secret archive to public imagination. Speculation about CIA motives must also be viewed against the backdrop of secrecy as strategy. Intelligence agencies sometimes cultivate noise, releasing information or allowing speculation to flourish as a way of obscuring other operations. Could the Mars session have been part of such a strategy? A harmless but captivating distraction, drawing attention away from more terrestrial programs? It is impossible to say. Yet the possibility cannot be dismissed. In the realm of intelligence, what is not true can sometimes be as useful as what is. By entertaining the fantastic, agencies muddy the waters, making it harder for adversaries, or even their own citizens, to discern the boundaries of reality. And then, there is the simplest explanation: curiosity. Intelligence officers, scientists, and even bureaucrats are human. They too wonder what lies beyond. They too are captivated by mystery. Perhaps the Mars session was nothing more than an indulgence, a chance to explore the fantastic under the cover of secrecy. If so, it reminds us that even the most rational institutions are not immune to the lure of the unknown. The legacy of the CIA's involvement is paradoxical. Officially, the remote viewing program was deemed of no value and shuttered. Unofficially, its strangest product, the Mars transcript, continues to inspire debate. In trying to test the limits of the human mind, the agency inadvertently created a cultural artifact, a modern myth dressed in classified paper. Whether intended or not, they ensured that Mars would never again be seen solely as rock and dust. It became a stage for imagination, where pyramids might rise and ancient beings might wait in silence. Perhaps this was the real outcome the CIA achieved, though unintentionally. They did not prove or disprove life on Mars. They did not validate or invalidate remote viewing. But they did plant a story that endures, one that still prompts people to question what we know, what we believe, and what secrets may lie beyond our reach. And in the end, stories can be as powerful as facts. They shape perception, inspire action, and define possibilities. The Mars session is one such story, a reminder that the boundary between intelligence and myth, science and imagination, is often thinner than we think. So why did the CIA look to Mars in 1984? Because in that moment, to ignore the possibility would have seemed more dangerous than to explore it. Because curiosity and fear are twin engines that drive human endeavor. Because even the most powerful agency in the world could not resist the pull of the red planet and its shadows. And because, whether they admitted it or not, they understood what we all feel when we stare at that distant world. That something about Mars whispers to us, something we cannot quite silence, something that insists there may be more than meets the eye. Long before satellites returned photographs and intelligence agencies flirted with psychic visions, Mars already carried a heavy burden of meaning. Ancient cultures, staring at the same night sky we see today, recognized the reddish light of the wandering star and gave it names filled with power. To the Babylonians, it was Nergal, the god of war and destruction, a celestial embodiment of fire and chaos. To the Greeks, it was Ares. To the Romans, Mars, both deities of battle and blood. Its color alone suggested violence, as though the heavens themselves were stained with rust and war. These myths were not idle. They reflected the profound tendency of humanity to look outward and weave narrative into the movements of distant lights. Mars, with its distinctive hue, invited story. As centuries passed, the stories deepened. In Egypt, Mars was woven into cycles of astronomy and ritual. In Greece, Philosophers speculated about its motions, puzzled by the erratic paths of the planets against the backdrop of fixed stars. By the time of Ptolemy, Mars had been charted and classified, its strange behavior captured within models of celestial spheres. Yet even these early scientific efforts did not strip Mars of its mystique. The planet remained a figure in myth, a beacon of divine struggle and cosmic order. Every culture that watched it rise and fall saw in it a reflection of their own values, fears, and aspirations. The invention of the telescope in the 17th century changed everything. Galileo, peering through primitive lenses, saw Mars not as a star, but as a disk, a body with dimension. Later observers detected light and dark patches, polar caps that seemed to grow and shrink with the seasons. The idea that Mars might be Earth's twin began to take hold. If the Moon revealed craters and mountains, perhaps Mars revealed continents and oceans. The leap from observation to speculation was swift. Writers and scientists alike began to imagine that life, perhaps even civilizations, might dwell there. The 19th century brought the most dramatic twist. In 1877, the Italian astronomer Giovanni Schiaparelli sketched lines across Mars, which he called canali. In Italian, the word could mean channels, natural formations, but in English it became canals, a word loaded with implication. Canals suggested construction, intention, desperate engineering. Percival Lowell, an American businessman turned astronomer, seized on the mistranslation. He built observatories, studied Mars obsessively, and declared that the planet was covered with a network of canals built by intelligent beings to transport dwindling water supplies. His lectures electrified the public. Newspapers printed maps of the Martian canals. Ordinary people began to imagine a dying civilization struggling for survival. A world older than ours, staring at its own end. Though many astronomers remained skeptical, Lowell's vision captivated the imagination. It found its way into literature, where it blossomed into something larger. H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds in 1898, telling of Martians invading Earth to replenish resources. In that tale, the Martians were not noble philosophers but predators, harvesting humanity like cattle. The story terrified readers, especially when Orson Welles' 1938 radio dramatization convinced some listeners that the invasion was real. Mars was no longer simply a world of canals. It was a mirror for our fears of conquest, scarcity, and extinction. Other writers painted Mars with a gentler brush. Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles, published in 1950, imagined a planet filled with melancholy beauty, where Martians and humans encountered one another in tragic and poetic ways. Bradbury's Mars was not just a scientific curiosity, but a stage for human longing, nostalgia, and regret. Through fiction, Mars became a place where we could explore ourselves. Whether as invader or victim, as builder of canals or as silent ruins, Mars was always us in disguise. The cultural weight of Mars by the mid-20th century cannot be overstated. It had become a canvas for our hopes and fears. It embodied the dream of other civilizations, the terror of invasion, the melancholy of loss. When NASA's early missions approached Mars in the 1960s and 1970s, they carried more than instruments. They carried centuries of myth. Each photograph transmitted across space was not simply an image. It was a revelation weighed against millennia of stories. The public waited breathlessly, not only to learn about geology, but to discover whether the myths were true. The reality was sobering. Spacecraft showed a barren world, cold and dry, with no canals, no forests, no oceans. The dream of Lowell's engineers was gone. And yet, in a strange way, the disappointment only shifted the focus. If Mars did not host thriving civilizations now, perhaps it once had. If not in the present, then in the past. And if not on the surface, perhaps underground. The myth adjusted, survived, and even grew. The discovery of the face in Cydonia and the speculation about pyramids did not emerge in a vacuum. They were nourished by centuries of imagination that had already cast Mars as a world of mystery. By the time the CIA tested remote viewing in 1984, the soil was fertile for visions. A subject asked to describe coordinates on Mars would inevitably carry in his subconscious centuries of myth, centuries of longing. When he spoke of pyramids and tall beings waiting in silence, he was not only describing a vision, he was participating in a tradition as old as Babylon, as new as NASA, projecting story onto the red planet. Perhaps that is why the transcript resonates. It is not just a product of one man's imagination, but of humanity's collective imagination, condensed into words. Mars has always been more than rock. It is symbol, mirror, myth, projection. It has been a god, a warlord, a dying world, an invader, a home of poets, a graveyard of civilizations. Each age gives it a new face, but the fascination remains. The 1984 document is one more mask in that long procession, one more interpretation of the red star that has haunted our nights since the dawn of history. To read it is to hear not only the voice of a remote viewer, but the echo of every storyteller who has ever looked at Mars and seen something more than dust. In that sense, the CIA's experiment was not unique. It was only the latest chapter in a story humanity has been writing for thousands of years. And like all chapters, it leaves us with questions rather than answers. Are the myths merely reflections of ourselves, or do they hint at truths waiting to be discovered? Does Mars echo with our imagination alone, or does it guard a history we have yet to uncover? Perhaps both. Perhaps the myths endure because they contain fragments of truth, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to look closely enough. When high-resolution cameras finally orbited Mars at the turn of the new millennium, scientists thought the long argument would be over. The Mars Global Surveyor and later the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter returned images with clarity unimagined in the 1970s. The so-called face on Mars was revealed as a rugged mesa, its features dissolving under new angles of light. The pyramids of Cydonia, once traced by authors as precise triangles, became irregular hills shaped by erosion. To geology, the verdict was clear. Natural formations, nothing more. But to those who had invested their hopes in the dream of Martian civilization, the sharper photographs did not silence the myth. Instead, they pushed it underground, where it continued to grow in whispers and speculation. If the monuments no longer appeared in the images, perhaps time had buried them. Perhaps dust storms had hidden their lines. Perhaps NASA, with its power to control information, had released only the photographs that supported its narrative. Skepticism shifted, no longer aimed only at the rocks, but at the institutions themselves. The persistence of belief in Martian ruins reveals something about human nature. Once a story captures imagination, it resists erasure. The lost city of Atlantis survives despite centuries of failed searches. The Ark of the Covenant continues to inspire quests. Myths are not defeated by data. They adapt, bending around new facts, incorporating them into evolving narratives. So it is with Mars. When canals were disproved, the myth became monuments. When monuments were blurred into mesas, the myth became buried cities. Always, the core remained, that Mars was once alive with intelligence, and that traces of it remain. One of the most striking elements in this ongoing saga is the fascination with geometric shapes. In the mid-1990s, when the Mars Global Surveyor released some of its earliest images, observers noticed unusual quadrilateral patterns on the Martian surface. Straight lines seemed to intersect at right angles, creating the impression of city grids. In regions like Elysium Planitia and Utopia Planitia, patterns of ridges and cracks were interpreted by enthusiasts as foundations of ancient settlements. The excitement was palpable. Websites circulated images with annotations, drawing boxes around shapes that seemed too orderly for chance. Cities on Mars? Headlines asked, inviting readers to imagine a metropolis eroded by time, its walls now half buried under dust. Scientists offered more prosaic explanations. They pointed to the effects of tectonic stress fracturing the crust, creating polygonal cracks. They explained how subsurface ice, expanding and contracting, could leave behind straight ridges. They described how wind and erosion exaggerate these patterns, turning random stress lines into what looks like deliberate design. Yet their explanations did little to extinguish the allure. Straight lines and right angles are powerful symbols because, in nature, they are rare. They are the mark of design, the fingerprint of intelligence. On Earth, we associate them with streets, buildings, and order. To find them on another world is to feel the rush of recognition, even if the lines are only accidents of geology. The arrival of the high-rise camera in 2006, capable of capturing details as small as a meter across, was supposed to close the case. Many of the suspicious patterns were imaged again in breathtaking detail, and their true nature was revealed. What had seemed like walls became ridges of sediment. What had seemed like city grids became natural fractures. The dream of Martian cities crumbled under magnification. But once again, belief proved resilient. For every image that debunked, believers found another anomaly, another photograph showing a shadow that looked like a doorway, a rock that resembled a statue, a cliff that hinted at a stairway. Mars became an endless canvas for pareidolia, a mirror of human longing projected onto stone. The fascination with lost cities on Mars also reflects deeper cultural currents. On Earth, we are surrounded by ruins. The stones of Machu Picchu cling to mountain ridges. The temples of Angkor Wat emerge from jungle roots. The streets of Pompeii remain frozen under ash. We know civilizations rise and fall. We know that time buries even the greatest empires. To imagine Mars as another Pompeii, another Angkor, is to extend this pattern outward, to see history as a universal cycle repeating across worlds. It reassures us that we are not alone in our triumphs or our collapses. If Martians once built cities and lost them, then we are part of a greater story, not unique, but connected. The 1984 remote viewing transcript resonates strongly in this context. The subject spoke of vast chambers, of walls smooth and towering, of labyrinthine spaces carved into cliffs. He described not scattered rocks, but architecture, intentional, massive, unmistakable. He spoke of shelters stripped of furniture, of rooms once filled with life, now empty and waiting. These details align perfectly with the longing for Martian cities, the desire to believe that somewhere, beneath dust and erosion, lie the bones of a civilization. Whether the subject tapped into actual visions or simply reflected the cultural imagination of his time, his words carry the same power. The dream of a city beyond Earth, silent but enduring. As the decades passed, even mainstream institutions began to recognize that Mars had once been more Earth-like. Evidence accumulated of ancient riverbeds, deltas, and lake beds. Minerals formed in water were found scattered across the surface. Once, billions of years ago, Mars was warm enough and wet enough to support life. This revelation added fuel to the myths. If water had been abundant, why not life? And if life, why not intelligence? The gap between science and speculation narrowed, though it never closed. NASA searched for microbes. Believers searched for monuments. Both were asking the same underlying question. What happened on Mars? The idea of lost Martian cities persists not only because of shapes in photographs, but because it speaks to something universal. Civilizations fall. We fear our own might one day join them. Climate change, resource exhaustion, war. These are the forces that haunt our headlines. When we imagine Martian cities buried in dust, we are really imagining ourselves, projecting our anxieties into the cosmos. Their ruins become our warning. Their silence becomes our possible future. That is why the myth endures, even against data. It is not only about them, it is about us. In the end, the quadrilaterals and grids on Mars are almost certainly natural. They are fractures, ridges, and erosional patterns created by geological forces. But as symbols, they are much more. They are reminders that we look at other worlds not only with our eyes, but with our hearts. We search for meaning, for connection, for stories that link us across space. The lost cities of Mars may never be found in stone, but they live already in imagination, in transcripts and photographs, in books and films, in every conversation that begins with the question, what if? And sometimes, what if is powerful enough to keep us searching, long after the facts seem to say otherwise. The 1984 transcript did not stop at monuments or pyramids. It also spoke of catastrophe. The subject described storms raging across the land, the collapse of an environment, and beings who knew they were witnessing the end of their world. He spoke of geological upheaval, of a planet turning hostile too quickly for survival. His words echo, perhaps unconsciously, the very scientific theories that emerged about Mars's past. That it once held seas and rivers, then lost them in a sudden decline. In the mythic tone of his vision, this decline became a disaster, a planetary tragedy that drove an ancient people either into slumber or into exile. Scientists working with the evidence of craters and atmospheres offer a plausible version of such a catastrophe. They point to the theory of impact, a massive comet or asteroid striking Mars in its early history. Such an impact could have shaken the planet, stripped away portions of its atmosphere, and unleashed a chain of events leading to rapid cooling. Evidence exists in the form of enormous basins like Hellas, scars so vast they can be seen from orbit, reminders of collisions powerful enough to alter an entire world. Combined with the collapse of Mars's magnetic field, which left it vulnerable to the solar wind, the stage was set for a slow but inexorable death. Where once water pooled, dust remained. Where once skies may have been blue, they turned thin and pink. For any life clinging to the surface, survival would have been desperate. if not impossible. The subject's vision fits this narrative in poetic form. He spoke of people hiding in pyramids against storms, of chambers stripped to essentials, of a society that knew its time was ending. He described a world decaying, its environment no longer able to sustain them. To skeptics, this is coincidence, a subconscious reflection of ideas already circulating about Mars. To believers, it is uncanny confirmation. How could a subject in 1984, guided only by coordinates, speak so vividly of what science would later confirm? That Mars was once habitable, then became barren? The notion of a planetary disaster resonates because it mirrors human fears. We live with the shadow of catastrophe ourselves. Asteroids still cross Earth's orbit. Supervolcanoes slumber beneath our feet. Climate shifts remind us of how fragile balance can be. When we imagine Mars collapsing under storms and impacts, we are also imagining Earth's possible fate. The myth of Martian catastrophe becomes a mirror, showing us what we dread in our own future. It tells us that no civilization, however advanced, can defy the larger forces of nature. The idea that Martians may have escaped deepens the myth further. The subject described vast ships, rounded and metallic, carrying survivors to another place. He described volcanoes and vegetation, a volatile world alive with storms, but also rich with life. Listeners could not help but think of Earth. Could Mars's catastrophe have driven its people here, seeding our planet with knowledge, myths, or even life itself? This is the essence of panspermia, the hypothesis that life migrates between planets via meteorites or deliberate effort. In scientific terms, it is conceivable that rocks blasted from Mars carried microbes to Earth. In mythic terms, it becomes the story of a refugee people fleeing a dying world to begin anew elsewhere. The impact theory of Mars's decline has support in geology, but the vision of beings experiencing it firsthand transforms data into drama. Numbers and craters tell of energy and force. A voice describing tall, fragile figures waiting for the end makes it human, or more than human. It allows us to feel catastrophe, not just measure it. Perhaps that is why the transcript continues to grip readers. It does not just describe Mars, it tells its story as tragedy, as if the planet itself were a fallen empire. The fascination with disaster is not unique to Mars. On Earth, we tell stories of Atlantis swallowed by the sea, of Sodom consumed by fire, of Pompeii buried under ash. We are drawn to tales where nature overwhelms civilization, where human effort meets limits. The Martian catastrophe slides neatly into this lineage, a cosmic Atlantis whose ruins lie not beneath waves, but beneath dust. The pyramids and obelisks of the subject's vision become the echoes of that loss, silent memorials to a world undone. Skeptics argue that the subject may have been influenced by cultural narratives already present in the 1980s. Speculation about planetary catastrophes was common, spurred by books and films that imagined disasters both terrestrial and cosmic. The Cold War itself hung over humanity like a sword, with nuclear winter a real and terrifying possibility. Against this backdrop, the subject's vision of a dying Mars might reflect not psychic perception, but cultural anxiety. The Martians waiting for rescue may have been metaphors for humanity waiting under the shadow of nuclear threat, fearful of an end they could not prevent. Yet even if the vision was shaped by culture, it gains power precisely because it taps into archetypes. A civilization destroyed by forces beyond control is an image that repeats across time and story. Whether it is myth, memory, or imagination hardly matters. It is an image that compels belief because it feels inevitable. The Martian catastrophe becomes part of a universal pattern, one that warns us as much as it fascinates us. Modern science continues to piece together Mars's history. Data from orbiters and rovers shows ancient river valleys, mineral deposits that formed in water, evidence of long-lost lakes. They suggest that Mars was once warm and wet for hundreds of millions of years. Then, something shifted. The magnetic field collapsed, the atmosphere thinned, and water vanished. Whether sudden or gradual, the effect was the same. A world once friendly to life became harsh and dry. This story is consistent with the subject's vision, even if his account dressed it in imagery of beings and monuments. The myth and the science, though different in method, converge on the same conclusion. Mars was once more alive than it is today. To imagine catastrophe on Mars is also to reflect on survival. If they existed, the beings of the transcript faced a choice: retreat underground, adapt to worsening conditions, or leave. We do not know which path they chose, or if they ever existed at all. But the possibility itself is enough to inspire. If they left, where did they go? If they perished, what remains of them? And if they endured underground, are they still there, hidden beneath ice and stone, waiting? These questions keep the myth alive, even in the face of skepticism. In the end, the Martian catastrophe is both history and parable. It is a story told through craters and dust, through transcripts and visions, through science and myth alike. It warns us that worlds change, that civilizations can fall, that survival is never guaranteed. It comforts us with the thought that even in loss, traces remain. Monuments, myths, or perhaps even descendants who carry fragments of another world's memory. Whether real or imagined, the catastrophe of Mars reminds us that we are part of a larger cosmic drama, one in which no world is exempt from the tides of time. Among the more provocative ideas connected to the Martian mystery is the concept of panspermia, the possibility that life does not begin in isolation but travels between worlds like seeds carried by cosmic winds. For centuries, philosophers speculated about whether life might be universal, planted throughout the cosmos by comets or stars. In modern times, scientists began to explore the idea more concretely. Meteorites discovered on Earth have been confirmed to have Martian origins, fragments of rock blasted into space by impacts that later fell to our planet. Within these meteorites, researchers have searched for signs of ancient biology, chemical traces, possible microfossils, structures that might hint at microbial life. Though the evidence remains debated, the very fact that Martian rocks have landed on Earth makes panspermia more than myth. It is a physical bridge between two worlds, a reminder that planets are not isolated but part of a larger dynamic system. The 1984 transcript, with its vision of beings fleeing Mars aboard great ships, resonates with this theory in mythic form. It is as though the scientific notion of microbes traveling across space has been magnified into a story of civilizations migrating. The subject described tall, slender figures departing their doomed planet, seeking refuge elsewhere, guided by desperation but also by hope. He described them entering a world of vegetation and storms, alive but volatile, a description that to many sounded eerily like Earth. If panspermia offers a mechanism for microbial exchange, the vision suggests a more dramatic version. Directed panspermia, the deliberate seeding of life by intelligent beings. Some scientists have even entertained this possibility, suggesting that advanced civilizations might spread life intentionally to ensure survival. In the mythic imagination, Mars becomes not only a neighbor, but perhaps an ancestor, its fall intertwined with our rise. The appeal of this idea is undeniable. To think that humanity may carry in its veins the legacy of another world is to redefine our identity. No longer would we be children of Earth alone, but of Mars as well, heirs to two planets bound by catastrophe and resilience. It would explain the strange persistence of myths of gods descending from the sky, of visitors who taught agriculture, astronomy, or architecture. Perhaps those myths are not mere stories, but distorted memories of Martian refugees who brought fragments of their knowledge to a young Earth. The pyramids, the monuments, the sudden leaps of civilization could all be reframed as echoes of that lost migration. Skeptics counter, of course, that this is romantic projection. The evidence for microbial panspermia is still tentative, and the leap from microbes to civilizations is vast. They remind us that Earth had all the conditions necessary for life to arise independently: water, organic molecules, energy sources. They caution against importing myths into science. Yet even as they speak, the allure of the Martian connection remains, because panspermia does not only address biology, it addresses meaning. It offers a story of continuity, of kinship across space, of survival beyond catastrophe. The idea that life can spread between planets has deep implications. It suggests that the universe may be more fertile than we imagined. If life arose once and then spread, then perhaps it has seeded many worlds. Each comet impact, each asteroid strike could scatter the ingredients of life across the cosmos. Some of these seeds might perish, but others might find hospitable soil. Earth, in this sense, may not be unique, but one of many gardens nurtured by the same ancient source. To imagine that source on Mars is to bring it close, to make the cosmic intimate. We would no longer look up at the red planet as an alien world, but as a relative, a place that once shared its essence with us. The transcript's vision of Martians waiting, some choosing to depart, others resigned to extinction, mirrors this idea in narrative form. They become not gods, but gardeners, sowing life where they could, ensuring that even if their civilization fell, their essence endured. Whether intentional or accidental, the effect would be the same: life on Earth carrying within it a Martian echo. The myth transforms into a parable of survival through generosity, of continuity through migration. And even if the story is only symbolic, it resonates with the truth that we ourselves now contemplate. Humanity, facing threats of climate change, asteroids, or other disasters, looks to Mars as a possible refuge. We build rockets, test habitats, dream of colonies. In doing so, we enact the very myth we project onto the Martians, preparing to scatter our seeds across space in case Earth falters. In this way, the vision is less about them than about us. It reflects our fears of collapse and our hope for endurance. The Martian exodus becomes a mirror of our own ambitions. Just as we dream of leaving Earth for Mars, so too we imagine Martians once leaving Mars for Earth. The cycle repeats, civilizations rising and falling, each seeking continuity beyond their home. This narrative binds us to a cosmic rhythm, one in which no world is forever, and survival depends on movement, adaptation, and courage. Scientific research continues to probe these questions. Mars rovers analyze rocks for traces of organic molecules, drill into ancient lakebeds, and search for signs of microbial life. Spacecraft monitor methane levels, hoping to detect patterns that might suggest biological processes. Meanwhile, laboratories on Earth study Martian meteorites, examining their microscopic structures for hints of fossils. Each discovery is small, cautious, incremental, yet behind it looms the larger myth. The vision of civilizations fleeing, of seeds scattered across the stars. The data and the myth run in parallel, one grounded in measurement, the other in imagination, but both driven by the same hunger to know where we come from. The possibility of directed panspermia also invites unsettling reflections. If life on Earth was seeded intentionally, then who were the seeders, and what was their purpose? Were they altruistic gardeners, spreading life for its own sake? Or were they survivors, desperate to preserve themselves by transplanting their essence elsewhere? If the latter, then we are not only their descendants, but their legacy, their attempt at immortality. To think of ourselves this way is both humbling and unsettling. It suggests that our existence is not an accident of chemistry, but part of a deliberate plan, a continuation of a story that began on another world. Of course, science cannot confirm such visions. The transcript remains testimony without proof, a narrative recorded in a government file. But its resonance lies in how it dovetails with panspermia, how it offers a dramatic, humanized version of a theory otherwise confined to microbes and molecules. It transforms sterile data into story, numbers into destiny. It gives us a way to feel what science only measures, the possibility that life is not confined, not isolated, but part of a great, wandering continuum. In the end, whether panspermia is fact or myth, whether Martians fled or microbes traveled, the effect is the same. It reminds us that we are not bound to one place. Life, once begun, seeks to spread, to survive, to endure. We are the latest expression of that impulse, building rockets, dreaming of other worlds, imagining ourselves as both children and parents of planets. The Martian myth, whether born of vision or imagination, is not just about what was. It is about what will be. It tells us that survival means reaching outward, scattering seeds, refusing to vanish. And in that sense, whether Martians ever lived or not, their story is already ours. Imagine, for a moment, that a pyramid were truly found on Mars. Not an ambiguous mesa or a trick of light, but a structure unmistakable in its geometry, its edges crisp, its proportions deliberate. The impact of such a discovery would be seismic, reverberating through science, culture, religion, and politics. For centuries, we have wondered whether we are alone. A pyramid on another world would end that question with the weight of stone. It would declare that intelligence has bloomed beyond Earth, that history is not ours alone, and that the cosmos is populated with stories larger than we ever imagined. The first wave of reaction would belong to science. Geologists, archaeologists, and astrophysicists would descend upon the find with urgency, desperate to measure, date, and analyze. What materials were used? Were they native to Mars or imported? How old is the structure? Thousands, millions, or even billions of years? Did it rise when Mars still had oceans, or after the waters had vanished? These questions would drive new missions, perhaps manned expeditions to study the pyramid firsthand. The discovery would not only answer old questions but open entire new fields: Martian archaeology, comparative architecture of alien civilizations, even the physics of construction under lower gravity. The cultural shock would be equally profound. For centuries, human beings have looked to the pyramids of Giza, Teotihuacan, and other ancient sites as symbols of mystery and endurance. To find their counterpart on Mars would suggest either parallel evolution of ideas or direct connection. Were the Martian builders and Earth's builders linked? Did knowledge cross the void, carried by refugees or messengers? Or do civilizations, when confronted with mortality, always retch for the same shapes, the pyramid's eternal stability? The questions would echo through art, literature, and philosophy, reshaping the way we understand not just Mars, but ourselves. Religions around the world would be forced to reckon with the implications. For traditions that place humanity at the center of creation, the existence of alien intelligence would demand reinterpretation. Were the Martians part of the same divine plan? Did sacred texts anticipate them in metaphor or parable? Leaders would search for ways to integrate the discovery into doctrine, some embracing it as confirmation of universal creation, others struggling with the challenge it posed to established hierarchies. Pilgrimages might even be proposed to the Martian pyramid, a new holy site in the cosmos. The shock could fragment some communities and unite others, forcing a global re-examination of belief. Politically, the discovery would ignite both cooperation and competition. Nations would scramble to claim involvement, to send missions, to control access. Who owns a pyramid on Mars? Is it a heritage of all humanity, or the property of those who first set foot there? Treaties would be tested, alliances strained, ambitions inflamed. At the same time, the enormity of the revelation might encourage collaboration beyond precedent. The recognition that we are not alone might push nations to set aside disputes, to see themselves not only as rivals on Earth, but as members of a species newly connected to a larger universe. Mars could become both the ultimate prize and the ultimate bridge. Technology would be scrutinized. If the pyramid contained inscriptions, mechanisms, or remnants of tools, they would be studied with obsessive care. Even the method of construction could teach us something new. Did the builders understand physics in ways we do not? Did they harness energy sources long lost to us? Could we, by decoding their knowledge, leap centuries ahead in our own development? The prospect of reverse engineering alien wisdom would drive investment and secrecy, with governments and corporations competing to unlock potential breakthroughs. Yet alongside hope would lurk fear. Fear of what such knowledge could do if misused. Fear of awakening powers we cannot control. For ordinary people, the impact would be more personal, more intimate. To know that others once lived, thought, built, and perhaps dreamed under the same stars would shift the way we see our daily lives. Suddenly, human struggles might feel smaller, our divisions more trivial, or conversely, some might feel threatened, dwarfed by the scale of a cosmic history that renders human achievements insignificant. Artists would respond with new works, writers with new epics, musicians with new hymns to connection. The Martian pyramid would become a symbol not just of alien history, but of human transformation. A reminder that we are part of something greater than our own narrow horizon. The psychological impact cannot be underestimated. For generations, skeptics and believers have debated the existence of extraterrestrial life. To see proof in stone would shatter that boundary. Some would feel awe, others dread. Some would embrace the idea of cosmic kinship. Others recoil from the threat of the unknown. The discovery might inspire a new age of exploration, or it might provoke fear and retreat. Just as the sight of Earth from space in the Apollo missions reshaped our sense of unity, the sight of a Martian pyramid could reshape our sense of belonging to the cosmos. Speculation about such a discovery is not new. Writers have long imagined it. Arthur C. Clarke suggested that alien monoliths might await us, designed to trigger evolution. Films like 2001, A Space Odyssey and Stargate presented structures as bridges to higher knowledge. The 1984 transcript fits into this tradition, describing monuments and shelters that serve as both refuge and symbol. Whether or not those visions were real, they anticipated the transformative effect that confirmation would bring. The myth itself has already shaped culture. Actual discovery would amplify it beyond measure. Yet there would also be danger. The temptation to see the pyramid as a message or prophecy could lead to fanaticism. Groups might claim to possess its true meaning, using it to justify ideologies or agendas. Misinterpretations could spark conflict, even violence. The same monument that could unite humanity might also divide it, depending on how we choose to respond. History shows that revelations, however grand, rarely produce uniform reactions. The Martian pyramid would be no exception. In contemplating this possibility, we confront the essence of human imagination. The pyramid, whether on Earth or Mars, is more than architecture. It is an idea, a statement of permanence against impermanence, of meaning against chaos. To find it on another planet would not only confirm intelligence beyond Earth, it would confirm that intelligence everywhere grapples with the same questions we do: how to endure, how to be remembered, how to leave a mark when time erodes all things. That is why the mere suggestion of a Martian pyramid, even in a remote viewing transcript, resonates so powerfully. It is not about proof. It is about the recognition of a shared cosmic struggle. If tomorrow a rover rolled up to a pyramid and sent back undeniable images, the world would change in an instant. But even without that, the myth continues to shape us. In dreaming of Martian monuments, we prepare ourselves for the day when proof does arrive, whether on Mars, another planet, or deep in the cosmos. The pyramid is both destination and symbol, pointing upward, urging us to reach higher, reminding us that the search for meaning is not confined to Earth. Whether in stone or in imagination, it stands, waiting for us to see it. Skepticism has always shadowed the myths of Mars. For every voice proclaiming pyramids and monuments, another insists on geology and chance. The principle guiding the skeptical view is simple and ancient. Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best. When confronted with photographs of angular hills or shadowed faces, scientists lean on this principle. Why imagine civilizations carving stone when wind and erosion are enough? Why posit ancient architects when natural processes can account for the same shapes? To the skeptical mind, the Martian mysteries are not mysteries at all, but examples of pareidolia, our brain's tendency to impose familiar patterns on the unfamiliar. We see faces in clouds, animals in constellations, and now pyramids in Martian mesas. Geologists, armed with decades of data, remind us that Mars is a world of extremes. Dust storms rage across the planet, sculpting rocks into jagged edges. Impacts from asteroids and comets leave scars vast enough to be mistaken for deliberate designs. Volcanic eruptions once poured rivers of lava, shaping plains into sharp ridges. Over billions of years, these forces combined to create landscapes both alien and strangely familiar. In this context, formations like the so-called pyramids of Cydonia are not anomalies, but natural results of a restless planet. High-resolution images have shown them to be irregular, weathered, lacking the precision that true architecture would display. To scientists, this is not evidence of civilization, but of human imagination stretching too far. The skeptical view goes further. It asks why, if Mars once hosted an advanced civilization, no definitive artifacts have been found. Rovers have traversed craters, climbed hills, drilled into rocks, and photographed landscapes in exquisite detail. They have discovered evidence of ancient rivers and lakes, minerals formed in water, and even seasonal methane spikes. But they have not found statues, inscriptions, or tools. No fragments of machinery lie buried in the dust. No ruins jut clearly from the surface. If a civilization once thrived there, why has it left nothing we can confirm? This absence weighs heavily on the skeptical argument. Civilizations leave traces, even when they vanish. On Earth, millennia-old pottery shards and stone walls survive. Should not something endure on Mars as well? Skeptics also point to psychology. The human mind is a pattern machine, evolved to detect threats and opportunities in chaos. Seeing meaning where none exists once kept us alive. It is safer to mistake a shadow for a predator than to miss the real danger. This same instinct now turns Martian rocks into monuments. The face on Mars, first seen in 1976, is a perfect example. In one photograph, under one angle of light, it seemed human. In others, it became just a mesa. The illusion was powerful because faces are among the first patterns our brains learn to recognize. The pyramids inspire the same reaction because their geometry suggests order, and order suggests intelligence. Skeptics argue that the only civilization creating monuments on Mars is our own imagination, projected outward into the dust. Yet skepticism itself does not kill the myth. In fact, it often strengthens it. For believers, every scientific dismissal sounds like denial. Every natural explanation sounds like evasion. The sharper the photograph, the more it feels like a cover-up. Why, believers ask, does NASA always explain away anomalies? Why do governments release information selectively? The lack of evidence becomes part of the narrative, proof of suppression rather than disproof of the claim. Thus, the skeptical argument and the myth become locked in a strange dance, each feeding the other. Science insists on caution. Myth insists on possibility, and in the space between them, imagination thrives. The skeptical perspective also raises a broader point. Even if Mars once had life, why assume it was intelligent? Microbial life is vastly more common and resilient than complex civilizations. On Earth, microbes have thrived for billions of years, while human civilization has lasted only a blink of cosmic time. To expect Mars to have produced builders of pyramids may be unrealistic. The presence of microbes would itself be a discovery of staggering importance, proving that life arises more than once in the universe. Yet the myth leaps beyond microbes, skipping to monuments and beings, because microbes lack drama. They do not speak to our hunger for kinship, for reflection, for confirmation that we are not alone in our struggles. Skepticism asks us to be satisfied with bacteria. Imagination asks for neighbors. There is value in skepticism, of course. Without it, science collapses into fantasy. It is skepticism that forces us to test, to measure, to doubt our own eyes. It was skepticism that led to high-resolution imaging of Cydonia, that sent rovers to drill into Martian rock, that confirmed water once flowed there. Skepticism does not close doors. It insists that doors be opened with evidence. Yet even skeptics admit that science cannot answer every question yet. Mars still holds secrets beneath its surface, in ice layers, in caves shielded from radiation. It is possible that microbial fossils, or even living microbes, await discovery. The absence of evidence from monuments is not proof of absence, but for now it is enough to temper claims of civilization. At the same time, skepticism alone cannot explain why the myths persist so strongly. Why do people cling to visions of pyramids and faces despite evidence to the contrary? Perhaps because myths serve a purpose that science does not. They give meaning where data offers only description. They weave human drama into cosmic landscapes. They remind us that our search for life is not only about biology, but about belonging. Even if the pyramids of Mars are illusions, they tell us something true about ourselves, that we are creatures who long to find reflection in the stars. The skeptical case rests on firm ground: erosion, geology, psychology. It is persuasive, logical, consistent. But logic does not erase longing. For every photograph that dissolves a monument into dust, the human imagination builds another in its place. That tension between skepticism and belief, between razor and myth, is what keeps Mars alive in our minds. Without skepticism, we would lose our anchor. Without myth, we would lose our wings. Together they ensure that the story of Mars is not finished, that we continue to look, to argue, to dream. In the end, skepticism reminds us to tread carefully, to separate hope from fact. But it also reminds us that even false visions can inspire true journeys. The face on Mars led to sharper cameras, better missions, deeper questions. The myths of monuments have pushed scientists to search harder, to prove with evidence what imagination first suggested. In this way, skepticism and myth work together, each sharpening the other. And so, even if no pyramid ever rises from the Martian dust, the story will continue, carried by the friction between doubt and wonder, a reminder that in the search for truth, both science and imagination have their place. Mars has always demanded attention because it is both familiar and alien, a neighbor close enough to glimpse yet distant enough to keep its secrets. Of all the planets in the solar system, it is the one that most resembles Earth, though in harsher, stripped-down form. Its landscapes stun the imagination not only because they are vast, but because they stretch human comparison to the breaking point. On Earth, we know canyons, mountains, deserts, and polar ice. But on Mars, each of these features appears magnified, exaggerated, as though nature itself decided to test extremes. When early spacecraft sent back images, what they revealed was a world of superlatives: the deepest canyon, the tallest volcano, the widest impact basin. Mars became a theater of grandeur, silent yet overwhelming, as if it had been carved to remind us of our own smallness. Take Valles Marineris, for example. Stretching more than 2,500 miles, this system of canyons slashes across the equator like a scar. It is nearly a quarter of the planet's circumference, wider than the United States from coast to coast, and in places 4 times as deep as the Grand Canyon. To stand at its edge, if one could, would be to look down into a chasm that swallows imagination. Scientists believe it formed through tectonic stretching, the planet's crust pulling apart, leaving behind fractures so vast they became valleys. Landslides, erosion, and perhaps ancient water carved it further. Whatever its origin, it is a reminder that Mars is not a passive world, but a dynamic one, shaped by forces violent and immense. In the shadows of Valles Marineris, one can easily imagine lost cities tucked away, ruins hidden beneath cliffs, myths waiting to be confirmed. Then there is Olympus Mons, the colossus of volcanoes. Rising more than 13 miles above the surface, 3 times the height of Everest, it is the largest volcano in the solar system. Its base sprawls nearly the size of France, its slopes gentle yet relentless, built from eons of lava flows piling one atop another. Unlike Earth, where shifting tectonic plates move volcanoes away from their heat sources, Mars's crust is fixed. This allowed Olympus Mons to grow in the same spot for millions of years, a titan born of geological patience. Today it is dormant, but its sheer scale challenges human comprehension. To imagine beings constructing pyramids on Mars feels fanciful, until one gazes at Olympus Mons and realizes that Mars itself is a monument, a world capable of shapes and structures beyond anything our civilizations have ever attempted. Further south lies Hellas Planitia, an impact basin over 1,400 miles wide and several miles deep, created by the collision of a massive asteroid billions of years ago. It is one of the largest craters in the solar system, so wide that it can be seen from orbit as a pale circle against the red terrain. Within its depths, atmospheric pressure is higher than anywhere else on Mars, leading some to suggest it could one day serve as a haven for colonists. But in mythic terms, it feels like a wound, a reminder of the violence that shaped Mars and perhaps destroyed its potential for life. The beings of the 1984 transcript, speaking of catastrophe and collapse, could easily have been recalling moments when impacts like this transformed their world forever. Mars's poles offer a different kind of majesty. At both ends of the planet lie caps of ice, composed of water and frozen carbon dioxide, expanding and contracting with the seasons. In winter, carbon dioxide freezes out of the thin atmosphere, blanketing the poles in dry ice. In summer, it sublimates back into gas, creating shifting layers and strange patterns. From orbit, the caps gleam like jewels, their white brilliance stark against the red deserts. Some images even show spirals etched into the ice, created by winds carving troughs over centuries. To ancient builders, such formations might have appeared as sacred geometry. To us, they remain symbols of a planet that still breathes in seasonal rhythm, even in its apparent barrenness. Scattered across Mars are dunes that behave like seas. Vast fields of sand ripple under thin winds, creating waves that march slowly across the surface. From above, they look like brush strokes painted in black and gold. Some form crescent shapes, others long ridges, shifting over decades but carved in patterns that echo the elegance of art. These dunes remind us that Mars, though frozen and arid, is not static. It moves, it changes, it reshapes itself even now. For those who imagine ruins buried beneath sand, these dunes are both promise and obstacle, covering what might lie hidden, preserving it for future eyes. Even the strange spiders of Mars, dark branching patterns that appear at the South Pole each spring, add to its aura of mystery. They are caused by carbon dioxide gas trapped under ice, exploding upward and carving channels into the surface. To science, they are fascinating seasonal phenomena. To myth, they resemble vast alien networks, as though something beneath the ice were reaching outward. Once again, Mars blurs the line between natural wonder and imagined meaning, inviting speculation while demanding evidence. Each of these features, the canyons, volcanoes, craters, poles, dunes, and spiders, feeds into the larger narrative of Mars as a world of extremes. And extremes are fertile soil for myth. When a planet presents landscapes that dwarf imagination, it is easy to populate them with stories of civilizations that rose and fell, of gods and builders, of tragedies carved in stone. The very scale of Mars demands narrative. It refuses to be seen as empty. It insists on being filled with meaning. Perhaps this is why the remote viewing transcript resonates so deeply. When the subject spoke of vast chambers and towering walls, listeners could picture them within Valles Marineris. When he described pyramids rising from depressions, one could imagine them near Olympus Mons or in the plains of Cydonia. When he spoke of storms and collapse, Hellas Planitia's violent origins came to mind. His words, though unverifiable, mapped easily onto the grand features of the planet, giving them human texture. In this way, the myth and the geology intertwined, each lending credibility to the other, each enhancing the sense of mystery. To walk through Mars, even in imagination, is to feel both awe and melancholy. It is a place where grandeur is undeniable, yet emptiness prevails. It shows us what a world can become when forces larger than life itself take control. And it invites us to wonder whether, in that emptiness, there was once fullness, life, intelligence, purpose, that has since been erased. The myths of pyramids and civilizations may not be true in literal sense, but they are true in the sense that Mars embodies them. It is a stage set for tragedy, a place where the imagination finds endless material, a world that reminds us of both possibility and loss. Mars is, above all, a planet that humbles. It forces us to recognize the scale of the universe, to confront the brevity of our own achievements against billions of years of cosmic time. Whether or not pyramids stand upon its surface, the planet itself is a monument, carved by nature into shapes that defy comprehension. The myths we project onto it are not separate from this truth. They are responses to it, attempts to make meaning out of immensity. In that sense, Mars will always be a world of monuments, whether built by hands or by wind, whether remembered in myths or measured in data. And in gazing at its vastness, we are reminded of our own fragility, our own longing, and our own small place in the drama of the cosmos. If the myths of Mars have persisted for centuries, it is because they have always found fertile soil in culture. Science has worked tirelessly to strip the planet of fantasy, to reduce it to rocks, dust, and thin air. Yet at every stage of discovery, Art, literature, and popular imagination have stepped in to re-enchant it. Mars is not only a scientific object, it is a cultural icon, shaped as much by stories as by telescopes. The tension between fact and fiction is precisely what keeps it alive in the human mind. Consider how often Mars has been cast as the stage for human drama. In 1898, H.G. Wells gave the world The War of the Worlds, a tale of Martian invaders descending upon Earth with tripods and heat rays. The novel was a warning about imperialism, about the vulnerability of civilization when faced with a more advanced power. Yet its choice of Martians as antagonists was no accident. Mars, already associated with war, became the perfect mirror for human fears of conquest. 4 decades later, Orson Welles' radio dramatization of the story triggered panic in parts of America. Listeners who tuned in late, missing the introduction, believed the invasion was real. The myth of Mars had slipped effortlessly into the realm of lived experience. Later, writers softened the image. Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles imagined the planet not as a threat, but as a place of haunting beauty, populated by delicate, tragic beings who watched humanity arrive with both awe and sorrow. His Mars was a mirror for nostalgia, for the loss of innocence, for the melancholy of civilizations meeting across gulfs of time. Bradbury's Martians, though fictional, echoed the slender beings of the 1984 transcript, fragile and contemplative in the face of decline. Fiction had prepared the ground for visions, and visions, in turn, reinforced fiction. Cinema, too, has kept Mars at the center of imagination. From early pulp films with rubber-suited aliens to blockbusters like Total Recall and The Martian, the Red Planet has been endlessly reinvented. Sometimes it is a place of monsters, sometimes of adventure, sometimes of survival against impossible odds. Each depiction reveals less about Mars itself than about humanity's anxieties and desires. When we fear invasion, Mars becomes hostile. When we dream of exploration, Mars becomes a frontier. When we confront loneliness, Mars becomes a mirror of isolation. The planet adapts to the cultural mood, always ready to embody whatever story we need to tell. The myths of pyramids and civilizations, though often dismissed, are part of this larger cultural dynamic. They survive because they satisfy a hunger that data alone cannot feed. Scientific reports tell us what Mars is. Myths tell us what it means. To believe in pyramids is to believe that intelligence is not unique, that civilizations rise and fall everywhere, that we are part of a larger cosmic narrative. Even if evidence is lacking, the idea gives shape to our deepest hopes and fears. And culture thrives on such shapes. They appear in novels, films, music, and art, becoming symbols of mystery and connection. The persistence of these myths is also fueled by mistrust. Institutions like NASA and the CIA operate with secrecy by necessity. But secrecy, even when benign, breeds suspicion. When images are released selectively, when transcripts appear decades after the fact, when official explanations dismiss anomalies without fanfare, people imagine what is not said. Conspiracies flourish in silence. The Mars transcript, once classified and then revealed, carries exactly this aura. Its very existence suggests that someone, at some level, thought the idea worth exploring. That is enough to keep speculation alive, regardless of evidence. Cultural memory works in curious ways. Once a myth enters the bloodstream, it becomes almost impossible to remove. The canals imagined by Schiaparelli and Lowell were disproven by spacecraft in the 1960s, yet the idea of Martian engineers lives on in novels and films. The face on Mars was resolved by higher resolution images, yet it still appears in documentaries and online debates. Myths do not die when disproven. They transform, adapt, and endure. They are not dependent on fact, but on meaning. And Mars, with its stark beauty and haunting silence, is the perfect canvas for meaning. Even modern science, despite its rigor, cannot help but feed the myth. Discoveries of ancient riverbeds and lakebeds remind us that Mars was once warmer and wetter, perhaps hospitable to life. The detection of methane spikes raises tantalizing questions about ongoing processes, possibly even biological ones. Each revelation, though cautious, reignites speculation. If water once flowed, could life once have thrived? If microbes existed, could they have evolved further? If the planet once supported forests of bacteria, why not cities of stone? The line from data to myth is short, and it is traveled quickly in the human mind. Popular culture amplifies this leap. Each new discovery is immediately woven into stories, news headlines, and social media posts. A rock shaped like a doorway becomes a global sensation. A shadow that resembles a statue is debated in forums for months. The smallest anomaly becomes evidence for the largest claims. In this way, science and myth operate in tandem, each fueling the other, each ensuring that Mars remains a place of wonder. The cultural power of Mars is not only in the stories we tell, but in the way it shapes our aspirations. The dream of colonizing Mars, championed by visionaries like Elon Musk, carries echoes of myth as much as science. To build cities on Mars is to enact the very legends of lost civilizations we project onto it. In some strange sense, we are preparing to become the Martians of the future, carving our own pyramids, leaving our own monuments, ensuring that when future generations look back, they will find ruins to speculate about. The myths of the past become the blueprints of tomorrow. It is possible that the greatest monuments on Mars will not be relics of an ancient civilization, but creations of ours. Long after our time, when colonies rise and fall, when human presence waxes and wanes, remnants will remain. Dust will bury them, winds will erode them, but traces will survive. Future eyes, human or otherwise, may look upon them and wonder, who built these? What stories do they tell? In that moment, the cycle of myth will repeat. Just as we look to Mars and imagine pyramids, so too might others look to our ruins and imagine more than was true. Mars will continue to be a mirror, reflecting not only what is but what we long for it to be. Thus, the myths of Mars endure because they are more than claims about rocks. They are expressions of our own imagination, our own need for connection, our own refusal to accept silence. Whether in fiction, in transcripts, or in speculative science, Mars remains a world of stories. And as long as it hovers in the night sky, glowing red against the darkness, those stories will not fade. They will evolve, multiply, and inspire, ensuring that Mars is never only a planet but always a mystery, always a stage for the human drama to play itself out across the stars. The story of Mars is not only about what we see through telescopes or what spacecraft send back in streams of data. It is also about the way humanity projects itself into the unknown. Whenever we look outward, we carry with us our fears, our dreams, our memories, and our anxieties. Mars has become the great mirror of these projections, reflecting not only the possibility of life elsewhere, but the fragility of life here on Earth. The myths of ancient pyramids and lost civilizations may never be proven, but they endure because they touch something essential: the fear of impermanence. Every empire on Earth has risen with the belief that it would last forever, and everyone has fallen. The ruins of Mesopotamia lie buried under desert sands. The temples of the Maya were swallowed by jungle. Even the massive pyramids of Egypt, symbols of eternity, are scarred and weathered, their outer casings long stripped away. We live surrounded by reminders that nothing endures, no matter how mighty. To imagine that Mars once had cities and monuments now lost to dust is to extend this pattern beyond Earth. It is to acknowledge that impermanence is not just human, but cosmic. Civilizations fall not only in valleys and along rivers, but also under alien suns. This is why the 1984 remote viewing transcript resonates so strongly. Its tale of tall beings lying in chambers, resigned to their fate, is a story we recognize in ourselves. It is the story of cultures watching their horizons darken, of leaders unable to halt decline, of people waiting for rescue that never comes. Whether or not Martians ever lived, the vision speaks to a universal truth: that intelligence does not guarantee survival, and that memory often outlives flesh. The monuments in the transcript are metaphors as much as visions, testaments to the human need to believe that something endures when all else collapses. Mars, in this sense, is not just another planet, but a stage upon which we rehearse our own anxieties. When scientists describe its lost atmosphere and vanished oceans, we hear echoes of our own climate fears. When believers speak of Martians fleeing in ships, we see reflections of our own plans to colonize space in search of refuge. When skeptics dismiss pyramids as mesas, we are reminded of how fragile hope can be when faced with data. The planet becomes a canvas, and upon it we paint our story of impermanence and the longing for permanence. Even our attempts to reach Mars today are colored by this drama. The rovers we send are not only machines of science, but emissaries of memory. Spirit, opportunity, curiosity, perseverance, each name chosen as if to declare that human will endures, even across millions of miles. Their tire tracks in the dust are temporary, soon erased by wind, but they are monuments in their own right. Future generations will remember them as the first steps in a journey that may one day carry us ourselves to Mars. In that sense, we are already building myths for the future, ensuring that Mars will not only be a place of imagined pasts, but of real human legacies. The impermanence of civilizations is not only a theme of archaeology, but of philosophy. From Heraclitus, who declared that all is change, to Buddhist teachings of impermanence, to modern reflections on entropy, the truth that nothing lasts has been a cornerstone of wisdom. Mars embodies that truth in stark, planetary form. A world that may once have had seas, and perhaps life is now silent, barren, and cold. It is a reminder writ large that permanence is an illusion, that even planets can fall. The myths of Martian pyramids are ways of wrestling with this fact, dressing it in story so that it can be faced. Yet alongside impermanence lies the human desire to resist it. We build monuments, write books, create art, and now explore space, all in the hope that something of us will endure. To imagine Martians doing the same, constructing pyramids to withstand storms, carving obelisks to mark their roads, is to see ourselves reflected. If they too fought against time, then we are kin in struggle, companions in the same cosmic battle against oblivion. Their ruins, real or imagined, become solidarity across species. Proof that the desire for permanence is universal, even if the outcome is always the same. This duality, impermanence and the longing to resist it, keeps the myths alive. Even if scientists declare that no pyramids exist, the story still speaks to us, because it is less about rocks and more about meaning. We will always wonder if others before us tried, failed, and left behind silent stones as their testimony. We will always look to Mars and see not only dust, but the possibility of memory. The transcript's monuments may not stand in reality, but they stand in imagination, and imagination is itself a monument of sorts, enduring beyond evidence. In the broader cosmic sense, Mars is only one example. Across the galaxy, countless planets orbit stars, many in the habitable zones where water could flow. Some of these worlds may have known life, perhaps even civilizations. By the time we discover them, they may already be gone, their monuments eroded, their voices silent. Mars is the closest reminder of this possibility, a neighbor whose silence feels heavy because it might once have spoken. To confront that silence is to confront our own fate, to accept that one day Earth too may be quiet, its monuments buried, its oceans gone, its skies cold. And yet, in the very act of contemplating this impermanence, we create permanence of another kind. The myths of Mars, the stories of pyramids and civilizations are now part of human culture, woven into books, films, art, and memory. They will outlast data sets and technical reports, living as long as humans tell stories. In that sense, Mars has already given us what we seek, not proof of alien life, but a myth that endures, a narrative that ties us to the stars. So when we speak of impermanence on Mars, we are speaking of ourselves. We are acknowledging the fragility of civilizations and the inevitability of change. But we are also declaring, in story, if not in stone, that we refuse to vanish quietly. Just as Martian pyramids are imagined as monuments against time, so too are our myths monuments of thought, standing in defiance of silence. They may not last forever, but they last long enough to remind us that we were here, that we wondered, that we reached beyond ourselves. Mars, barren and silent, becomes the teacher. It tells us that nothing is eternal, but it also inspires us to try. It shows us the ruins of a world that may never have had cities, and yet we imagine them anyway, because imagining is our way of building pyramids against time. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that impermanence does not end the story, it creates it. Without it, there would be no reason to build, to remember, or to dream. With it, we find purpose in carving meaning, whether into stone, into transcripts, or into the stars themselves. At the edge of this long journey, when the last document is read and the last photograph examined, we are left with more questions than answers. Mars remains silent, but its silence has never stopped us from filling it with stories. The pyramids of Cydonia, the obelisks of remote viewing, the tall beings waiting in chambers, all of these may be illusions, the result of shadows, erosion, and imagination. Yet their persistence across decades reveals something profound about us. We do not tolerate emptiness well. We crave meaning in every landscape, every shadow, every distant world. Mars, with its stark beauty and haunting desolation, has become the perfect canvas for this craving. If one steps back, the arc of the Martian myth is clear. In ancient times, it was the god of war, a fiery omen in the sky. In the 19th century, it became a world of canals and desperate engineers, imagined by Lowell and Schiaparelli. In the 20th century, it transformed into a source of invasion or melancholy, from Wells's War Machines to Bradbury's poetic chronicles. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Mars became the site of conspiracies and mysteries. Faces, pyramids, CIA transcripts, whispers of civilizations long gone. At every stage, Mars has adapted to reflect our own cultural moment. It is a chameleon, changing not because it changes, but because we change. What, then, does it reflect now? In our age of climate crisis and environmental anxiety, Mars mirrors our fear of collapse. Its dried riverbeds and vanished oceans remind us of our own fragile balance. The myths of civilizations waiting in shelters, hoping for rescue, sound like parables for us, warnings of what might come if we ignore the lessons of survival. When we dream of Martians fleeing to Earth, we are dreaming of ourselves fleeing Earth for Mars, carrying our legacy across space to preserve it against catastrophe. The story circles back endlessly, always about us as much as about them. The scientific picture is cautious but not hopeless. Mars was once habitable. It held lakes, rivers, perhaps even shallow seas. Microbial life could have arisen there. If so, some of it might still persist underground, shielded from radiation. The search continues, with rovers drilling, orbiters scanning, and future missions planned to return samples. These efforts may one day reveal that life, at least in its simplest form, once existed on Mars. That discovery alone would be profound, confirming that Earth is not unique, that life is not an isolated accident. But it will not end the myths. Even if microbes are found, the imagination will still ask, what if there was more? What if intelligence once walked those valleys, leaving behind monuments now lost? The tension between science and myth is not a conflict to be solved, but a rhythm to be lived. Science tells us what is, myth tells us what it means. We need both. Without science, we are lost in fantasy. Without myth, we are starved of meaning. Mars endures because it sits precisely at this crossroads. It challenges us with data and seduces us with story. It demands skepticism and rewards imagination. In that duality lies its power, greater than any single discovery could provide. The CIA transcript, preserved in the dry language of intelligence work, will continue to haunt because it embodies this duality. It is neither proven nor disproven, neither wholly credible nor wholly dismissible. It lives in the gray zone, a modern myth written on government paper. Its visions of pyramids and beings waiting in silence may be fiction, but they are fiction that feels true because they echo patterns we know. Civilizations fall. Beings hope. Stones endure. The transcript's greatest gift is not evidence, but resonance, the way it makes us feel the weight of impermanence and the allure of continuity. As we look ahead, Mars is no longer only the subject of myth. It is the target of ambition. Nations and private companies plan missions to land humans on its surface. Engineers design habitats, study resources, imagine cities beneath domes or carved into cliffs. The dream of colonization is no longer confined to fiction. It is an active project, one that may unfold within our lifetimes. In this sense, the myths of ancient Martians become blueprints. We project onto Mars what we hope to do ourselves: build, endure, leave monuments for the future. Perhaps one day, when dust buries our settlements and time erodes our machines, others will find traces and weave their own myths about us. And so the story comes full circle. Mars may never have held pyramids or civilizations, but it will. Not theirs, but ours. We will become the Martians, carving meaning into that landscape, building our own myths in steel and stone. Our ruins will stand where we once dreamed of others. The face in the mesa will be joined by the real faces of human statues, carved or erected as markers of our presence. The myths we invented about Mars will become realities, because we carry the need to create them with us. In the end, the truth of Martian pyramids is less important than the truth they reveal about humanity. We are a species that longs for connection, that refuses to accept silence, that sees in every shadow the possibility of a story. Mars has not yet answered us, but it has given us something perhaps greater: the chance to hear ourselves, to see the patterns of our imagination laid bare against a barren world. Whether or not there were ever Martians, Mars has already fulfilled its role. It has shown us who we are, and so we return to the question that has lingered from the start. Are we alone? The answer, for now, remains uncertain. But perhaps the real lesson of Mars is that we have never been alone in the ways that matter. We have always carried our myths with us, filling the cosmos with meaning, refusing to let the universe remain silent. Mars is not empty. It is full of the stories we tell, the fears we project, the dreams we chase. And as long as it shines red in the night sky, those stories will continue, weaving science and myth into a tapestry that stretches from ancient gods to future colonies. Mars may never give us the monuments we imagine, but it has already given us the monument of imagination itself. That, in the end, is the greatest discovery. Not that pyramids rise from Martian dust, but that human wonder rises endlessly, turning dust into myth, silence into story, and a cold red planet into one of the richest canvases of meaning we have ever known.